ABC News. This is 9/11. Now reporting from New York, Peter Jennings.
Before we went out to Shanksville to spend time with the president, who was spending time with the families, we were talking about air travel in the country and some of the extraordinary changes that have occurred in the airline industry in the last year. The changes have been very slow in coming at the nation's airports. In fact, in a recent test done by the government at 32 major airports, they show screeners actually missed fake guns and explosives for almost 25% of the time. The government had set, as we've told you many times on the news, a November deadline for hiring thousands of federal screeners and a December deadline for the installation of bomb detection equipment. In a phrase, it has not been going well. Lisa Stark covers aviation for us.
It was unprecedented. Planes were grounded. Airports fell silent. The nation's air transportation system shut down for days. And when it reopened,
tickets and ID, please.
Some things were the same.
Has anyone unknown to you asked?
Strangers asking.
These bags have been in your control since you packed them?
And some were very different.
Go ahead and reach your right foot up for me.
Cut you from your knees down to your ankle.
Oh, you got a belt on too? Unbuckle that for me and you hold it off to the
Need
side.
to touch you everywhere you be. Is that okay? Yeah, that's fine.
Secretary of Transportation Norman Mineta.
Since September 11th, everything has been about security.
Everything, including reinforced cockpit doors.
Do not move! This is my plane!
Thousands of new air marshals rushed into training, hurriedly deployed. Closer scrutiny of checked bags.
This bag did not go through proper security. No. So it's going back. Yeah, it's going back.
Extra security checks at the gate.
Okay, go ahead and put your shoes back on.
And on some planes, cameras trained on passengers, watched by pilots in the cockpit.
Have permission to scan you? Yep.
But the biggest change of all, the federal government, through its new Transportation Security Administration, is now in charge of aviation security. TSA screeners, better trained, better paid, are taking over at the checkpoints.
I just think it's different now. I think it's a more professional type of job now, and I don't think it's like it was before.
Some passengers feel safer.
I feel pretty safe, though. I mean, I wouldn't be traveling with my kids if I didn't feel that it was safe.
I think it's okay. I'm not nervous. Should be fine. Not thinking about it.
And to some extent, that's the idea.
A lot of it is to make people feel better. Perception is a big part of the traveling public. We want to get the travelers back on the planes.
If I can have you step over to the table, please, for secondary screening.
But are the new security measures adequate to protect the public? Bruce Baumgartner runs Denver International Airport.
It is much, much more secure than before 9/11. And I wouldn't say that it's absolutely perfect. I don't know that any of us could afford a perfect system, but it's much more secure than it ever has been.
But there are still holes in the system. By mid-November, TSA screeners are supposed to take over security at more than 400 airports.
You're here for the TSA?
Yes, ma'am.
But despite dozens of job fairs, the government has hired and trained less than half of the 33,000 screeners needed for the checkpoints.
One bag to Ontario, California.
Right now, few bags are screened for explosives. All checked luggage is supposed to be by the end of the year. The TSA now admits it cannot meet that congressional deadline. But in the rush to do so, the industry says the TSA will spend billions on bomb detection machines with a high error rate.
They can develop machines that are much more accurate than the very inaccurate machines today. We ought to buy those machines. I can't believe we would spend billions and billions of dollars on machines that don't work.
With the focus on passengers and luggage, cargo gets virtually no screening for explosives. And all those people who have access to the tarmac and planes, they must have background checks, but few airports require them to go through security when showing up for work.
They're free to completely go around the X-ray security machine and carry anything on their person that they want to, be it a knife or a bomb, a handgun, whatever they like.
Passengers are still trying to bring on banned items. These were collected in just 2 days at Baltimore-Washington Airport.
We get everything under the sun, from straight razors like this,
unbelievable,
to even more dangerous items like this.
No one believes 100% security is possible. It's why pilots want guns in the cockpit.
It's a last line of defense. When all of these filters, all of these porous layers of security have failed,
then it's time to go for the gun.
Some flight attendants are taking self-defense classes on their own. Many worry the training airlines are doing is wholly inadequate.
A year has passed, and nothing has been done to prepare us to meet this situation should it occur, or maybe I should say when it occurs again.
And then there's the issue of profiling, choosing passengers to search based on their background. Should we?
I think it's better than what we're doing now. And if you have a clear conscience, then you shouldn't be worried about being profiled or our rights. We lost some rights on September 11th.
The airlines say security will only be effective when it focuses in on passengers who are more likely to be a risk. Does this look like a terrorist? Or this?
This is a huge, huge mistake if we do not ramp up the intelligence across the board so that we know who's coming into the country, so we know who's going onto our airplanes, and that is the only way that our passengers will truly be protected.
Lisa Stark is with us very briefly. Lisa, to add to this at the end, I've asked people to give report cards to those areas they cover. What do you think overall?
I think it depends on which area. Maybe a B to the screening, even though they're still missing some things. The federal screeners are taking over and they're getting better. I'd have to say a D or lower on certain areas. They're not screening bags for explosives yet. The perimeter, there's some issue about whether airport perimeters are patrolled enough, and cargo certainly isn't being looked at.
A year later, do you think there's more or less urgency about all this?
I think things do sometimes settle down into a pattern, and that is the risk. You need to keep up the urgency. I think the deadlines, to some extent, are keeping the Transportation Security Administration's feet to the fire.
Many thanks. Lisa Stark in Washington for us today. That is Reagan Airport, Washington Airport. Oh, she's in Denver. Oh, I beg your pardon. I thought she was in Washington. My apologies. I know where Ron Claiborne is. However, he is in Boston, and he has been at Logan Airport this morning. I think he's on the phone at the moment. Ron, you there?
I'm here, Peter.
That must have been a tough morning at Logan today, from whence 2 flights left a year ago.
It was a very tough morning for the employees, both of United Airlines and American Airlines, who were at Terminal B, where that first plane that struck the World Trade Center, American Flight 11, departed, where the passengers had boarded. Just before 8:46 this morning, about 30 ticket counter workers, some baggage handlers, supervisors, they gathered behind the counter. At first, they seemed a little awkward. After all, they were being watched by a number of reporters and camera crews, photographers. But they seemed almost to surrender to the emotional power of that moment. They put their arms around each other. Some of them held hands. Heads were bowed. On the looks of many of them, you saw expressions that seemed almost stunned anew. It was a very poignant moment, and in a sense, Peter, it became, in a way, more tense and intense with grief as it went on. It seemed to last a very long time. I think it did go on more than the minute of silence that was called for. Several people were crying, and at one point, a woman sobbed out loud, audibly. Then it ended. They went back to work. There was almost a sense of relief, people hugging each other, and then going back to work.
Ron, from top down at Logan in the last year, airport authorities and employees have really been hammered. Are they past that?
They're not past that. It seems that Massport, which runs Logan, and federal officials keep trying to make strides in improving the security, and it seems every 1 or 2 months there's some new revelation of breaches of security. The most recent one being, I think, reporters from the New York Daily News. A number of airports, including Logan, had managed to, in a test, bring potential weapons on board a flight. And there's also a sense, Peter, that I have that Logan, besides its persistent security problems, has almost a feeling of guilt that this is the location that the hijackers, most of them on those 2 flights, boarded. They say at the same time there was probably nothing they could have done about it, but again, I do get that sense that people feel guilty in a way.
They're not alone. Many thanks, Ron Claiborne, ABC News correspondent in the Northeast, based in Boston. Brings us to John Nance, our aviation analyst for a long time, commercial pilot, author, travels huge amount. Just pick up on what Ron and Lisa said. How do you think it is? Is it better? You flew in yesterday. How was it?
Yeah, I did. I think Lisa stated it correctly when she said a B, perhaps, for the Transportation Security Administration. They've really been doing a good job of putting people who can communicate in these positions as screeners. But they are hamstrung. Last night in Orlando, I'm at the gate, Peter. I'm going to be looked at myself, and there is a 91-year-old great-grandmother, about 4 feet 9 inches high, being wanded by these folks. They were extremely polite. But the fact was, they were mortified themselves. And I asked them, don't you have the discretion to take a look at this woman who is clearly not a threat to the United States and say, go ahead, get on board your airplane? They said, no, we do not have that discretion. This is one of the things that has to change. It is absurd for us to be blind to the realities that we've got to take a look at people and make decisions on the spot. Who needs to be looked at, who doesn't?
Well, I think you're beginning to approach this whole notion of racial profiling. Well, let's get there in a second. But it seems to me that if you give people on the ground discretion like this, someday we're going to get smacked by a 91-year-old grandmother.
Well, it always has to be done with a certain degree of unpredictability. I've been arguing for the last year that we need a discretionary-based system. Customs is not perfect, but they are a discretionary-based system. When you come through customs, you never know how they're going to treat you. You never know whether you're going to be singled out. And that uncertainty is what will keep us safe from the type of planners who hit us a year ago, because what they were planning for years was a situation of near certainty. They didn't want any uncertainty. The more we present them with uncertainty, the greater our defense system.
So let's approach the delicate subject, because it's been a subject of great delicacy all year for lots of people, and that is racial profiling. It automatically, say, Muslim and Arab Americans, just insults an entire community. What do you do about it if you're trying to run an airline security system?
Well, I think you first have to start with what we're trying to accomplish. We are absolutely trying to prevent access to an airplane by anybody who would misuse it. And when you back drive it from there, we have not just a need, we have a national responsibility to make sure that we use intelligence and common sense in deciding who we need to look at more. And that's not racial profiling. That's profiling on the basis of everything from national origin to just how they showed up at the airport that day.
Well, who are you going to look at? John Ashcroft, the Attorney General, said yesterday, in upping the security level today, said they are most concerned about the threats in Asia. So let's accept that we have done some racial profiling of young men from the Middle East. Do we now add young men from the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia?
Based on intelligent assessments. I mean, if you come to work that morning and there is a bulletin that we've got to be looking at a threat from this particular arena, maybe young white American males from the Southwest, and that's what we need to be looking at. One of the questions we need to find out each and every time, are we dealing with an American citizen? What is the background? And these are questions that all of us should be prepared to answer. After all, we're prepared to be wanded and to sit there looking like a criminal being shaken down there at the gate. So if we are willing to do that, why are we not willing to go one step further? There's never any excuse for discrimination, Peter. Absolutely not in our country. But there is every rationale for being more intelligent about the way we're applying these things, and these random checks don't work.
Let's talk about some of the other programs. The Air Marshal program. I hear mixed reports. I hear that they haven't got enough of them and they're working so hard that they just want off the job. Is that true?
I think it's a mixed thing. I think some of them who have left the job have been pretty disgruntled. It's a work in progress, like any human endeavor. I think it's going to be a very good program when it's finally put together. One of the things these folks need to learn is that they've got to be absolutely invisible. They've got to look like all of us. Not all of that has been done correctly. And the sleeping business and flying them too much, that's just part of the growing pains of the agency. We don't want them on every flight, but we want them out there.
I've heard it suggested that maybe government is trying to do too much under the pressure of those of us in the public, of course, and under the pressure of politicians, that maybe they should be a little more focused on what they're trying to do. Do you have any notion about that?
I think they're very focused. As a matter of fact, I think they've created a lot of order out of a lot of chaos in 1 year. Standing up a new federal agency is an amazing thing to do. By the same token, I think that we cannot depend on just the government doing these things. For instance, the idea of putting these screening machines for the bags in the airports. Many of the airport managers are screaming that they can't do it in time, but there's a deadline that Congress placed. Somehow that needs to be negotiated, not to sweep the deadline away, but to make it realistic, and that kind of negotiation involves the carriers and the airports, too.
And briefly, if you wouldn't mind, before we move on, I've been really impressed by the public. I mean, the public has been extraordinarily patient. Yeah, there have been some bad apples, but not many.
Yeah, the public has been incredible, not only in their almost infinite patience as they continue to deal with these terrible companies that are now going by the boards as we federalize the screening system, but also in this regard. 3 times in the past year, we have had passengers come immediately to the defense of the crew in flight. 2 times with deranged people who tried to get in the cockpit, and once with that idiot with the shoe bomb. And this is a new world, Peter. Our crew is now no longer just in the cockpit and in the cabin. It's all of us.
Thanks, John. It's really nice to see you.
Good
John Nance, our aviation analyst. Not many people talk more intelligently about aviation in every respect. I'm reminded, looking at another book here, here's a book by a man named Jim DeFeed. It's called The Day the World Came to Town, and it continues us in our air travel mode. There have been a couple of books produced out of Canada this year about the extraordinary experience that about 6,000 passengers who were flying that day had when they ended up being diverted to Gander in Newfoundland, which is the easternmost province in Canada, in the Atlantic Ocean, and thus began quite an extraordinary love story between the people who were there and the people who they showed up on. Jay Shadler has gone back to check it out.
Gander, Newfoundland, in the Forest Province in Canada, claims a half-dozen bingo parlors, a curling club, and a 4-foot wooden moose.
I'm embarrassed to say I never heard of it before.
Not until last September 11th, when the airspace over the United States was closed for the first time ever. And as these dramatic radar images show, 38 commercial jetliners carrying 6,500 passengers were simultaneously rerouted to this tiny town on an island at the easternmost edge of North America.
Beef and turkey and ham.
Tired, hungry, and worried about family and friends back home, the stranded travelers had turned into refugees.
It really hit me what Gander had been doing for the last several hours, preparing for the 6,000 unexpected guests.
Overnight, Gander's population of 10,000 swelled to nearly 17,000. Striking bus drivers came off their picket lines to shuttle passengers to makeshift shelters in schools, churches, and meeting halls.
We believe in doing good deeds for good people, especially the Americans.
The people of Gander, on this horrible situation of September 11th, they restored my own faith in humanity.
After 4 days, the airport finally reopened and the passengers headed home. Since then, grateful passengers have donated $60,000 to the town of Gander.
Hi!
And 1 month ago, 2 of those passengers kept a promise to themselves and the town by coming back.
You guys mean so much to us. Back home, people wear these caps. They symbolize our heroes. And you guys are our heroes, too.
Hats for heroes. Seems that in this remote corner of the world, on the darkest day in memory, Gander, Newfoundland gave 6,000 strangers a reason to believe. Jay Shadler, ABC News.
I have seen some of the email traffic over the last year between people who ended up in Gander in Newfoundland, and it's just quite extraordinary. They really have long-term relationships now. Back to Shanksville for just a moment. The president is still there. As we said earlier today, there's almost a haphazard notion to the way this makeshift memorial in Pennsylvania has sprung up. Just to remind you, Shanksville is a place about 245 people, I think, very much off the beaten track, taken them completely by surprise when people began to come down their back roads to see, first of all, you know, where the crash site was, and it's that, what's left of it is that great mound out there in the middle of the field. But as the president has come there, hundreds, and in fact thousands of people have now begun to descend on Shanksville in an intermittent sort of way. Some of them, again, to repeat myself, on their way to Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, one of the great battlefields of the Civil War, and a shrine in its own way to so many people. And the president is still there, and ABC's Dan Harris is still there. Dan, what's been going on?
Here, the president's still talking with about 250 immediate family members of the people who died aboard Flight 93. There was a private service in the field where that plane crashed at 10:06 a.m. 1 year ago today. The president laid a wreath. There was a moment of silence. Taps was played. Prayers were also offered by two pastors who are relatives of people who died aboard Flight 93. The Reverend William Adderley, who I believe is the father of Flight Attendant C.C. Lyles, who quite famously made a call to her husband as the passengers apparently made their decision to storm the hijackers. Also, the Reverend Paul Britton, who's the brother of Marion Britton, a census worker who was on board Flight 93 as well. And as you see, the president continuing to talk with the family members. This the second time he has met with them, the first time being September 24th at the White House.
Dad, how hard is it to drive out to Shanksville?
It's about an hour and a half, if not 2 hours, from Pittsburgh, and it is very much an isolated place. As you mentioned, 245 people here. This is a town with no gas station, no restaurant. There is a general store, and as one person told me yesterday, the general store is the biggest industry in this town. And I should say it's not even a town, it's actually a village.
Now, as sometimes happens, it happened in New York a little bit. It hasn't happened in Washington because it's the Pentagon, but it sometimes happens at places which become deeply interested and connected to the public. Little enterprises spring up related to them. Has anything like that happened in Shanksville?
Yes, and it has been somewhat controversial. There are stands around town selling T-shirts, selling other mementos, started by people who live in the village. And there are others in the village who feel that this is crass and that it's making a profit off of tragedy. So there is a mini debate brewing in this town. There's also a debate over the future of this town, given the fact that they are definitely going to have a federal monument, a historical park in their midst in the very near future, and people are concerned about development here, changing the character of the town. There's debate about whether putting up a hotel, putting in restaurants is a good thing.
Thanks, Dan, very much. As we've said earlier today, that there's something of a debate about the passengers on United Flight 93, whether they are victims or whether they are heroes, some victims. And that will continue. And the general debate about who was a victim and who was a hero on 9/11 a year ago, I think may never be resolved. But in one particular instance, at this moment, at least, we can talk to somebody who was, without question, a hero. We're joined from the Pentagon today by Sergeant Major Tony Rose, who has been at the Pentagon ceremony, and they're repeating much of it today. He is the Army Senior Career Counselor, and he is there on the right. He rescued many of his colleagues that day, including the Lieutenant Colonel on his right, our left, Regina Grant, who's the Executive Officer in Human Resources at the Pentagon. I wonder if we might start with you, Colonel Grant, and tell us why we admire Sergeant Major Rose so much.
Mr. Jennings, this is my angel. and he led me by the strength of his voice. He stuck with me throughout that horrific day of smoke and jet fuel where I couldn't breathe. I had completely given up, and he stuck with me by directing me as I yelled for help through that smoke. Well, he is certainly an angel. He is certainly an angel.
It's great to hear a colonel talk that way about a sergeant major, no question. What has today been like for both of you? First, Colonel Grant.
Well, Mr. Jennings, today I have very, very many feelings throughout my soul. I feel proud because the nation stands here showing resolve and resilience. And I feel sad because of so many comrades that I've lost. And then today brings back memories of that very day. However, it's a day of healing. I'm able to move forward and take all the resilience, resolve, and the sadness and grow from it. So I'm really proud to be here today.
Sergeant Rose, if I remember correctly, you were sitting at your desk watching on television the disaster unfolding at the World Trade Center when the plane hit the Pentagon, about 150 feet from you?
Approximately, yes, sir.
And you went in and out of the Pentagon 5 times to save people?
Yes, sir, I did.
And what does this day mean to you?
This is closure. This was a good day to be a soldier. And you look around and see the flags flying. It's a good day to be an American. People are sticking together, and the spirit of healing is just all over the place.
Sergeant Rose, it must be in the building, however, that it's always with you. Am I wrong?
No, sir, you're right. Every time we walk in the building or walk down the hallway, we remember those that are no longer with us. Sometimes we'll be going down the hall to take an action to someone for help, only to realize we're not here anymore.
And have you felt a lot of pressure this year, either you or Colonel Grant, to talk about your experiences a year ago today?
Not pressure. It's good to be telling the story, though, to keep America aware that this act of terrorism could have happened anywhere. Anybody watching you today could be standing where we are right now. We just have to stay vigilant.
Would you mind telling us a little bit of the story from a year ago that's most important to you?
I think it's the look in the eyes of every person that we could save as we reached into the smoke and under debris and grabbed hands. The eyes showed fear, but they also showed determination that they were going to live, and it just reminded me how strong the human spirit can be.
Colonel Grant, Sergeant Major Rose saved you, but you lost at least one good friend in Kabul.
Well, I lost many, but specifically, it was one that when the lights went out, we were eye to eye. And this whole year, I've lived with his death, and but I lost many friends.
Well, I want to thank you both for joining us. As the President said today, you made the country proud, both of you. Thank you. Lieutenant Colonel Regina Grant, Sergeant Major Tony Rose.
Thank you,
we're going to continue our coverage, but first another September 11th postscript on what some of the kids did to raise money for the victims. Do you remember all across the country how much the kids got involved? On September the 11th, Ashley, Aubrey, Alana, and Alyssa Welch didn't know if their father, who works at the Pentagon, was alive. It took hours for them to find out that he'd survived. The next day, to raise money for the relief effort, the teenagers started Wash America at a local gas station in Annandale, Virginia.
Car wash! Car wash! Honk if you love America!
Before long, there were car washes all across the country, and young people have raised more than $84,000 for the Red Cross.
ABC News, 9/11 continues. Once again, Peter Jennings.
We're going to spend the next half hour talking about something that I reckon everybody in the country has a stake in. First of all, the war in Afghanistan and what it has led to, the wider war on terrorism, which is, or campaign against terrorism, which some people prefer to say, which began after 9/11 a year ago today, and the relationship between the two, and now, of course, the President's interest and decision that perhaps there should be a preemptive attack against Saddam Hussein in Iraq. The talk of going to war began almost immediately after 9/11 a year ago today. At least one senator in Washington, Senator Chuck Hagel of Nebraska, referring to that attack 60 years ago, which so surprised the nation, has now called this the second Pearl Harbor.
We have to determine who was responsible, why this could happen without detection from so many different locations within the United States, and then respond accordingly.
I think that this act obviously is one which would constitute an act of war.
We, the democracies of this world, are going to have to come together to fight it together and eradicate this evil completely from our world.
You are suggesting that the United States now fight on the same level as the people who have committed these acts against the United States.
You betcha. When you fight a war, that is what you do.
I'll tell you, Peter, there is a pervasive sense of anger among the military officers I've talked to today. They are ready to go to war. There is a sense of war here at the Pentagon.
So the sounds of war, the discussion of war just got very intense from that day on, and it became very quickly clear that the target was going to be the Taliban government in Afghanistan, which the U.S. said repeatedly was harboring Osama bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda network. Finally, on Sunday, October the 7th, U.S. planes attacked the Afghan capital, Kabul. President Bush had made it clear from the very beginning that the war on terrorism would also extend far beyond Afghanistan. You remember his famous refrain, you're either with us or you're against us in the war against terrorism. And the U.S. military then got involved in such far-flung places as the Philippines and the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. We're going to go back to the Pentagon now because our colleague, ABC's John McWethy, covers this in a more immediate way than I think anybody else in the shop, and to ask, you know, how has the U.S. done in this last year as its role in the war against terrorism? John?
Well, Peter, if you talk to people in the military, especially the leadership, they are going to tell you that because of U.S. military actions, the United States has made a great deal of progress in the war against terrorism. And I asked this question of two people who have very strong feelings about it. One was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Richard Myers, and the other was, of course, Secretary of Defense, Don Rumsfeld.
One thing we've learned about the Al-Qaeda organization is that they are a thinking enemy, that they adapt to their adversary. We're going to have to adapt and even improve, in fact, improve our capability to stay inside his decision loop and to have him reacting to us and not the other way around. And we're working very hard on that.
What about of leadership?
We've taken a pretty good chunk out of the leadership. There is much more that needs to be done. We know we've disrupted terrorist operations worldwide. We could spend a major part of our time in the administration, or for that matter, the rest of our natural lives working this issue. And I think that'll be the case.
How are we to view this 1 year after? Some successes, but clearly some struggles still to go.
Well, I would say amazing successes. The Afghanistan as a terrorist training camp is stopped. The Taliban that was hosting the Al-Qaeda is out of office. A new government has been elected. The success elsewhere in the globe has been substantial. Over 2,000 people have been arrested and are being interrogated. Information's being gathered. A number of terrorist attacks have been stopped and foiled through cooperation from these 90 countries in the coalition. It's just an amazing accomplishment in a very brief period of time.
What Don Rumsfeld does not talk about in that interview are some of the failures. Osama bin Laden, whereabouts unknown, Al-Qaeda leadership still out there, still organizing to a certain degree, and stability in Afghanistan, a major question in the months ahead, Peter.
John, we talk and hear a lot about Afghanistan at the moment. In that building, is there a sense that maybe this could get out of control and that the instability which you've just referred to could lead to civil war?
There is always a concern that when you have what is essentially a feudal system of government with warlords that are trying to bind themselves together in some sort of a national government, that there is going to be a lot of struggles in the months ahead. I think the military still has a somewhat positive attitude, despite the fact that there are some warlords that the U.S. is now having to lean on rather hard. But there are many questions about how this country is going to survive, how Afghanistan is going to survive, if and when the U.S. military and some of its coalition partners have to diminish their presence.
Is there anybody in that building more confident than Secretary Rumsfeld?
Well, no. I mean, Don Rumsfeld is a very thoughtful person on how he views Afghanistan. He approached it in a very wary manner to begin with. He was the one that tried to rein in the United States, as various people said, we need to go in there in a big way and put in lots of soldiers, do all the peacekeeping. Rumsfeld said, no, 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 no. We need to fight the war. We need to hunt the terrorists and let other of the coalition partners do some of the other important jobs there.
Many thanks, John McWethy, again at the Pentagon. He's been there since early morning. It's been very difficult to criticize the war effort for people who believed it should be criticized. It's often difficult, or more difficult, at a time of war. It is difficult to criticize a commander-in-chief who has such a huge popularity rating in the country, and President Bush's popularity rating in our latest polls now show that his popularity is greater now, or his popularity in how he's doing his job is greater now than throughout the entire presidency of Ronald Reagan. So it isn't always easy. But one politician who has taken at least the Afghan campaign on so far, Senator John Kerry, he's a Democrat from Massachusetts, and he is with us today in Boston. Senator Kerry, what made you decide in the first instance, I don't wish to paint you with too dark a brush here, but what made you decide in the first instance that it was necessary to criticize aspects of the U.S. campaign in Afghanistan?
Well, I was asked a question, Peter. I mean, I gave an honest answer, which may be rare in politics, but I was on Meet the Press, I'm sorry to say, another network.
All right.
And I was asked a question about whether there were, you know, what was the measure of success, what was the measure of failure. You know, today is a day to remember people who died and the attack, and I'm sort of uncomfortable in the position of sort of going into the strategy and talking about what we're in the war, because I think that so many good things have come out of that day. But what I said, you know, I have nothing but admiration for the work that the troops did on the ground. Our guys who went in those small special operations teams, worked with Hamid Karzai, worked with the Northern Alliance, did a brilliant job of soldiering. I mean, they deserve enormous recognition today, especially because they showed initiative and creativity and made something happen. But all I said in answer to the question is, look, the Taliban was not the principal focus. The Taliban didn't attack us. Al-Qaeda attacked us. The Taliban are a collateral component of how you get to Al-Qaeda. And the Taliban, in fact, were hated by most of the people in the country. This was not a, you know, I just don't paint it quite as optimistically as others. It was a stumbling block. We cured it. But now major components of Al-Qaeda have dispersed. They're in other places in the world. We still hear perhaps in 60 countries. So to me, the war talk, the war rhetoric is in excess and perhaps even not even the appropriate rhetoric for what we're facing. This is a major intelligence operation and a law enforcement operation, more than it is a sort of a war as we've known it. And occasionally, special operations will be needed in order to go after cells and particular terrorist entities.
Let me interrupt you for 1 second just to say that I was also sensitive when I knew I was going to talk to you about whether or not this was the day to talk about failures of government or perceived failures of government. And I agree with you, it's a sensitive moment. On the other hand, sir, a lot of people are paying attention today, and so I ask you these questions in the spirit of an honest and necessary debate to the democratic process. We hear reports about Al-Qaeda going back to Afghanistan, and if that turns out to be the case, what does the United States do? Does the United States have the right policy in place to deal with them now?
Well, I don't believe that we even have the right policy in place with respect to the rebuilding of Afghanistan. There are many people who have asserted that we have not put enough people in the country in order to begin to make that kind of transition. That may be one of the reasons why Al-Qaeda has the capacity to perhaps go back in. You know, this is very difficult to do on the cheap, and it's very difficult to do very quickly. In addition to that, I think that many of us feel that the United States has needed to proceed in these past weeks in a way that brings people to our effort, not pushes them away. That there has to be a greater effort to reach out to other countries, to other people, to explain our case and to build support for what we're doing. We all support what we're doing. No one in our country, there's not a sliver of daylight between any member of any party or any political ideology with respect to the need to win, with respect to our commitment to do so, and our absolute unity behind the president, whatever decision he winds up making.
Let me interrupt you again, because there is the beginnings of a debate about what the president policy should be about Iraq, and whether or not the president, among other things, is not distracting or being distracted or distracting from the war against terrorism by talking so much about unilaterally hitting Saddam Hussein.
I believe we are not at the moment of making a unilateral decision, Peter. We have in place an inspection agreement because of the ceasefire agreement that went in 1991. That ceasefire agreement calls for Saddam Hussein to live up to a certain standard of weapons inspections. It seems to me that the place to start is not with talk of invasion or war or preemption. The place to start, it was with a discussion about the enforcement of the weapons inspection process, which ultimately licenses you to do regime change as the ultimate enforcement mechanism. So
you support the president at the moment. If Mr. Hussein doesn't live up to the Security Council resolutions, you're in favor of attacking him?
I'm in favor of using whatever means are necessary as you go through a scale. I don't think it automatically means your first step is to attack him. You may, well, let me change that. Your first step may not be to invade, but you may indeed want to attack in certain ways that are very thoughtful and very targeted and very strategic, and begin to put pressure on him. And I think there are many ways to go at this short of having made a unilateral decision that all you have on the table is invasion.
Many thanks. Senator Kerry, I appreciate you taking the time today, and I know you feel the same way about this day as everybody else does. Didn't mean to imply for a second otherwise. We want to go to Pakistan now because one of the people we've relied on a good deal in the last year or so is Ahmed Rashid, who is the author of a book called Jihad. He's also a correspondent for the Far Eastern Economic Review and the Daily Telegraph in Britain, but he spends an awful lot of time both in person and on the phone with us. Ahmed, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
How would you characterize I'm well, thank you. How would you characterize the current U.S. position in Afghanistan?
Well, I must say I respect a lot what Senator Kerry has said. I mean, I don't think what is in question here is that how the U.S. is conducting present operations against Al-Qaeda. I think the real question is how is the U.S. conducting the peace or the semi-peace situation in Afghanistan, and that has meant bringing in money for reconstruction and taking the lead in bringing in peacekeepers, not just in Kabul, but in some of the cities outside. And I think the failure of the international community over the last 6 or 7 months has been their inability or refusal to live up to what they pledged to do in December when the new government was set up in Kabul, that is money for reconstruction and peacekeepers.
Now, do you notice in the countryside whether that commitment is being met or not met?
Well, it certainly is not being met. No major reconstruction projects have started, although the Karzai regime has been in power now for 9 months. There are no peacekeepers outside Kabul. Only now has the U.S., the Defense Department, said that they would encourage European countries or other countries to perhaps send more peacekeepers to go outside Kabul. But I think the real situation is that everyone is looking for the U.S. to take the lead. Unless the U.S. is going to take the lead about pushing all the Western donors to provide money for reconstruction on a very quick basis, and also to expand security and stability in Afghanistan by providing peacekeepers, we are going to see this government in Kabul go downhill very rapidly. We've already had some really violent incidents in Kabul, the attempted assassination of President Karzai a few days ago. And really, you know, when you look at Karzai, what he's been saying simply is that he has nothing to offer anyone. He has no money, he can't give people jobs, he can't give them the vision of hope and expectation that there was 9 months ago. Now, Afghans are very patient, but there's a limit to their patience.
Ahmed, let me ask you this. Our daily lives are full of rumors about Osama bin Laden, and most recently a series of reports that Al-Qaeda is beginning to move back into the protective cover of Afghanistan in some way, shape, or form. Yeah. Is it the same there, and what do you hear?
Well, I think the deteriorating situation in the south of the country amongst the Pashtun population, who initially supported the Taliban and where much of the war took place and is still taking place, they are feeling very alienated. And I think there's a growing anti-American feeling there. There's a growing sense of alienation and frustration with their own government. There are ethnic problems with a rival ethnic group, the Tajiks. And I think this is all giving Al-Qaeda, Taliban, a new kind of feeding ground upon which they can try and go back into Afghanistan and try and reorganize some kind of opposition against the U.S. presence. The third element in this is that there's a new...
Is what?
The new element in this is, of course, the presence of Gulbuddin Hikmatyar, the renegade
one of the warlords in Afghanistan.
From the 80s. Yeah, and he is now joined up with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and U.S. troops are trying to get him in the east of the country.
Ahmed, thank you very much for giving us time. I know it's late where you are. Appreciate your wisdom as always. Ahmed Rashid, who is in Pakistan tonight. Let's go briefly now to Afghanistan. There are 10,000 troops still in the country. Their mission is somewhat different than what it was 10 months ago. And as Ahmed Rashid said, there's a new government in the country. Its stability is still very much in question. ABC's David Wright is at Bagram Air Base. David, can you hear me?
I can indeed, Peter.
Good. You're just north of Kabul this evening. You've been there for a week or so now. What's your own assessment of stability in the country?
Well, there's a good deal of nervousness on the streets. As Ahmed Rashid was saying, there's a sense around this country that Hamid Karzai does not have the support needed to really secure his leadership. Most leaders in Afghanistan's history have earned their stripes through being warlords, through being warriors. Hamid Karzai is a politician, and there's a sense out there that there's a good deal of uncertainty about whether he'll be able to lead Afghanistan without greater support from the U.S. troops.
Do you get any sense, being with American troops as you are today, and we watched earlier the ceremony today for their commemoration of 9/11, that they are in any way, shape, or form uncertain or unsettled by the current state of the mission?
Absolutely, Peter. There are great security concerns for troops around here. Artillery was brought in for the first time to protect the troops in Kandahar. And early this morning, the day began with potshots being taken at one of the guard towers here at Bagram Air Base. Every day, there are concerns about security. And we have to remember that the Soviets were here for a year before opposition coalesced against them. And there's concern here that the longer U.S. forces remain here, they will become fairly big targets for a community that is, unless they're able to win hearts and minds.
Many thanks, David. I see you're also, among other things, about to lose your light. I appreciate you giving us the time today. David Wright, our correspondent in Afghanistan, our current correspondent in Afghanistan. A lot of people get to visit. Going back to September 11th, a year ago, the U.S. got support from virtually all of the Western world in the weeks immediately after September the 11th. There have been some major disagreements since then, and there's some serious disagreements at the moment about what the policy should be about attacking Saddam Hussein in Iraq. There is unease, I think it's fair to say, over what many people see as the Bush administration's increasing willingness to go it alone, though there's some slight alteration in that yesterday when we learned that the Bush administration supports the notion of certainly a Security Council resolution being written in New York, timed to the president's arrival here at the UN later this week. But there has been unquestionably a rise in anti-American sentiment in various parts of the world, including in Europe. We asked ABC's Richard Gisbert, who's based in London, for us to put together a short piece on European attitudes towards the United States a year later.
There are many ways to express sympathy, and Europe used them all last September.
We stand side by side with you now, and I give you, on behalf of our country, our solidarity, our sympathy, and our support. I believe that sense of solidarity is echoed right round the world.
1 year later, a television poll in Britain, America's closest European ally,
Possibility of an attack on Iraq. Just press the
on who is the greater danger to world peace, Saddam Hussein or George Bush. 63% say Bush.
There is still sympathy in Europe for what happened a year ago. What there isn't is support for President Bush's agenda. That started to fade in January when Bush made his State of the Union address.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil.
And that was the moment where the unlimited solidarity, as the expression went, collapsed.
America will do what is necessary to ensure our nation's security.
Europeans heard a Bush administration trying to link the new agenda of how do we deal with fanatical terrorism with the old agenda of rogue states and loose nukes.
The speech reminded Europeans of their many differences with the U.S. France complains about American policy in the Middle East. Belgium opposes the U.S. on the environment, the Kyoto Treaty. And Germany refuses to back a war in Iraq. All magnified by Washington's acting as if it doesn't need France.
The overall message is that we are America, and we do what we think is right to do, and either you understand it and you follow us, or you don't. We don't care. We can do it on our own.
They want to know, why is America against the International Criminal Court? Haven't you caused a lot of casualties in Afghanistan? What will you do after Saddam Hussein? And by the way, how are you treating those prisoners in Guantanamo Bay?
1 year after 9/11, there is a feeling in Europe of an opportunity wasted. That if the U.S. wants allies in the war on terror, it should treat Europe better.
In terms of allies, who else are you going to call? The Japanese, the Indians, the Russians?
Traditionally, the U.S. has called on the Europeans. Now that alliance is being tested. Richard Gisbert, ABC News, London.
Very much being tested, as we can discuss at greater length. But there's a key phrase, I think, in that piece from Richard Gisbert: sympathy, but not support for the United States. At the moment, it's part of the price the United States pays for being the single superpower left in the world. In the Middle East, certainly in the Arab world, the situation is worse, and there is something of a new factor in the struggle to shape public opinion there. It is, and we've all seen bits and pieces of it, the 24-hour Arab television network Al Jazeera, which is based in the Persian Gulf. It's not the only one, but it has a particularly powerful reach throughout the region, and all sorts of people throughout the Middle East who never had access to live events except through the constrained, controlled press of their government before, are now very often to see events in their own region live and on television. The Bush administration clearly knows it needs to win hearts and minds in the region, but is having a difficult time. Since September 11, it has become clear just how much antipathy there is in the region itself, particularly because of the struggle between the Israelis and the Palestinians. We asked ABC's Jim Wooten to put together a Middle East report for us.
In the Muslim world, very little sympathy for America's losses. Instead, anti-American celebrations and demonstrations. And here, perhaps, an explanation of sorts. America pretends this is the century of democracy, this woman says. But where is democracy, and where are human rights for Palestinians? And that is the crux of it. The U.S. alliance with Israel versus Muslim support for Palestinians. And as the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians continues, so do anti-American passions, fueled by those who don't believe the U.S. war on terrorism is strictly that. Many insist it's against all Muslims. It doesn't much matter that that isn't true, and it doesn't help to debate it. Public opinion here along the Nile, all across Egypt, and in most other Arab countries is pretty well set in concrete and hasn't changed in months. And that opinion is this: the West is waging a war against Islam in behalf of Israel, or in some versions, in behalf of the Jews. Which is why Osama bin Laden's a hero to many Muslims, and his enemies theirs as well. Even moderate Arabs like Hafez al-Marazi, an American citizen from Egypt, says it's all about the Middle East.
They are not disappointed in Israel because they don't expect anything out of the government of Israel, but they are disappointed in the U.S. because they have high expectations.
Yet in the Muslim world, anti-Americanism was flourishing even before last September 11. And for a long time after this first anniversary, it seemed certain to remain. Jim Wooten, ABC News, Cairo.
Anti-Americanism always flourishes with some people in the Middle East. On the other hand, there's wild pro-Americanism among a lot of other people as well. Let's go to Cairo live because ABC's Bob Woodruff is there. Bob, we're having the debate in this country now about the Israelis and the Palestinians and what's going to happen with the U.S. and Saddam Hussein. What's the latest from Cairo on that?
Well, as you said, Peter, before, a lot of sympathy here, but not support. This is pretty typical of the newspapers that came out in the Arab world today. A 22-page insert, news about the attack on the World Trade Center 1 year ago, and then new reporting on the background of Osama bin Laden. There has been sympathy expressed by just about every Arab country over here for the innocent victims of 9/11, but not much support, as you said before. In fact, from some Arab countries you wouldn't expect it from Syria, which said that they expressed their condolences for the victims, but they said that Arabs are also victims of this. From Iran, of U.S. policy rather, also from Iran, they also expressed sympathy and condolences for the United States, but they also said that the United States now needs to make the next move to try to open up and expand relationships with Iran and the rest of the Arab world. What is absolutely unanimous over here, Peter, is that the bombing of Baghdad, led by the United States or involving the United States, would be a very bad idea. They are afraid that Baghdad, or Iraq rather, could split up into three pieces, the Kurds in the north, the Sunni Muslims in the middle, and the Shiites in the south, and that could expand and to destabilize this entire area. And they believe that if there is an attack on Iraq and Saddam Hussein is overthrown, that this could simply bolster Israel and the interests of the Israelis. Peter?
Bob, you spent a lot of time on the streets in the Arab world. How different is opinion in the streets from the government? And the press, which you held up this evening, is certainly in Egypt and a great many other places, to a large measure, government controlled.
That's right, Peter. I don't know. I think at this point there's a lot of agreement between the leaders in the Arab world and the people on the street. You ask them how prevalent these feelings are about resentment of the United States, and they say now, for the first time, it really is across the board. You've had President Bush getting on TV and people seeing him say, for example, that Ariel Sharon, the head of Israel, is a man of peace. Juxtaposed against those words are images of Palestinian children being killed. This is what people see on the streets now. The leaders know it, the leaders see the same thing, and they tend to agree with the people on the street that something needs to be done. So you're seeing some unanimity here, Peter, that you didn't see before.
I appreciate it, Bob. Thanks very much, Bob Woodruff, our correspondent in Cairo tonight. I want to turn to two people here now who are genuinely, I think, can be regarded as experts in the region. On my immediate right is Fawaz Jess, who is the professor of Middle East and International Affairs at Sarah Lawrence College and has been with us before. And to his right, Fareed Zakaria, who is the editor of Newsweek International. Can I just ask you first the question about starting with you, Fareed, with Al Jazeera? I remember being stunned in the Arab world and thinking, my God, for the first time, public opinion in the Arab world actually means something because people can share these live events in a way they never could before.
The mystery of Al Jazeera, Peter, is that it is the most free, not just television channel, but probably media form in the Arab world. And it is in many ways more anti-American than the state. Society in the Arab world is often more anti-Semitic, anti-American, illiberal in various forms than the state, because you have in the Arab world many societies that have been politically repressed for so long that when you open up a valve, what comes out is a tornado.
And Fareed, I often feel the same thing, that when we get this deep antipathy on the streets, and I realize you can't judge by the streets completely in the Middle East, they're really angrier at their own government than they ever are at us.
Well, yes, but let me add one footnote to what Fareed said. I think what Al Jazeera and LBC and others have done, LBC, the Lebanese
broadcasting company,
that the government can no longer control information, the flow of information. And as such, public opinion now has become a factor in the political equation. But I don't know, I have difficulty, Peter, just dumping all the problems on the bloody authoritarian governments. I mean, there are some real issues here, real issues which have to do with American foreign policy. I think the perception that American foreign policy has been insensitive to Muslim Arab concerns. I mean, take a look at what the administration has done in the last 1 year. I mean, there was a great deal of empathy for the American victims after 9/11. But then, since then, I mean, we were very reassured that the administration would really take concrete steps, at least to rethink some of its foreign policies in the region. But, well, what has happened? Hands-off approach toward the Arab-Israeli conflict, a militaristic posture toward Iraq, insensitivity to Muslim concerns. The administration is using democracy as a stick against its enemies and not rather than as an alternative, a framework to replace the dominant authoritarian structures. And I think these elements, rather than using really media gimmicks to influence public opinion, we need to focus on the substantive relationship between that part of the world and the United States.
Let me ask Fareed, in some respects, the same question. Do you think this has been a bad year for the United States in the region as a whole, with the exception of the support that President Bush has given the Sharon government in Israel?
Oh, I think it's been a bad year. I think that part of what we face in the Arab world is who we are. just the most powerful country in the world, a country that controls the destiny of these people who seem to be going nowhere in their view. But part of it is what we do. And we haven't been doing well in the Arab world. I think a lot of it is sins of omission. I think that we could have been much more engaged. We could have seemed to care. Even if you look at the way we have gone about the campaign against Iraq, it's almost as though we're dragged kicking and screaming to consult with allies, to go to the United Nations. Now, we're going to have to do it all anyway. But if we had started out in a very different mode, listening and leading, building a consensus. Well, look at Afghanistan. We are now agreeing with the idea that you need security outside of Kabul.
Let me give you something small, but not small at all. And what should the United States be doing at a time like this? When the Palestinians, who've been struggling with the Israelis for almost 50 years and have lived under occupation for a long time, began to use suicide bombers against Israeli citizens, how did the Bush administration have any choice but to say this was horrendous and push the Palestinians off the map?
Absolutely, and I think the Palestinian leadership made some very strategic blunders, not only in not appreciating the impact, the great impact of 9/11 and its really effects on the American public and the American leadership, but also in not appreciating the fact that suicide bombings are morally wrong. This is point one. But also, I think, on the other hand, we need to appreciate the difficult conditions under which Palestinians live. No one is suggesting that the administration should support, the current Palestinian leadership, but at the same time, what is the vision that we have for the Middle East?
Okay, let me I wish we had we all three of us know how complicated this is, but let's just take one issue. The president's coming to the United Nations this week. He's going to be tough on the United Nations for not forcing the Iraqis to abide by the resolutions. There's going to be a new one, perhaps. Fareed, if the United States attacks Iraq, you heard Bob Woodruff say there'll be turmoil in the Arab world. Do you really believe that?
I don't, actually. I think that if it goes well militarily, which I think it will, there will be 2 or 3 bad weeks, after which people will be presented with a new reality. The real struggle for the hearts and minds of the Arab world will not be the war against Iraq. It will be the post-war handling of Iraq.
Because lots of people in the region like to get rid of Saddam Hussein. It's not just the Israelis.
And on the street, Saddam Hussein is despised because everyone realizes this man is a totalitarian. If we build a modern Iraq, a progressive Iraq, a pro-modern country, we might really be able to change or begin to change the Arab world. But that's where a lot of...
So it's the follow-through, it's the staying power.
It's the staying power, which is very long, expensive, and difficult, and which, frankly, looking at Afghanistan, the Bush administration has not wanted to do.
Fareed, I'm going to give you the last word. I'd like you to make it, if you would, about Saudi Arabia, because it has been an up-and-down relationship for much of its history, which goes back to the Second World War, but it has been very difficult, given the fact that so many of these hijackers a year ago today were Saudis.
Absolutely.
What happens?
I think there's a great deal of social upheaval under the surface in Saudi Arabia. I think there's a great deal of tensions between the government and the Islamist opposition. And I think for so long, these particular tensions have not really been examined and analyzed. But I think at the other hand, we have to ask the question, can we afford to sacrifice a strategic relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States? And what's the alternative to the Saudi Arabian royal family? Because we know, as Fareed mentioned, that the dominant opposition tends to be much more anti-American than the existing, authoritarian governments. The tragedy of Arab politics, Peter, is that both the existing governments and the dominant oppositions are anti-democratic and anti-liberal. In fact, and the question is, how can you have democracy if you have very few Democrats in the Arab world?
Many thanks to both of you. We read you regularly here, both you, Fareed, in Newsweek, and you in a variety of newspapers. It's really nice to listen to you today. Thanks very much. Fawaz Jajes and Fareed Zakaria. We are going to be right back. First, another September 11th postscript.
Kimalaya Nyoma is a medical student at Stanford University. He's a member of the Maasai tribe in Kenya. After seeing the September 11th attacks, he returned to Kenya and told his tribe about the destruction. The Maasai had trouble with the concept of collapsed skyscrapers and thousands of deaths, but they wanted to fulfill their duty as warriors. 9 months after the attacks, the Maasai blessed 14 cows and gave them as cherished gifts to an American diplomat in Kenya.
When we come back, New York firemen and policemen honor their fallen comrades in a most unusual way. Plus, they had to help in any way they could. Meet the unsung heroes of 9/11. And where did all the money go? Billions were donated to 9/11 disaster relief funds. But is the money going to where it's needed most? Then, in tonight's special coverage, Diane Sawyer with stories of 61 mothers and 63 precious reasons for hope. 9/11 continues on ABC. From ABC News, this is 9/11.
So most everybody has left Ground Zero in New York now, and it's similarly true at the Pentagon. The people are still gathered at Shanksville in Pennsylvania, but they have left this. This was called the Ring of Honor, the Circle of Honor, early this morning, and you can see now it reminds one a little bit of so many places in the country after September 11th a year ago, including Union Square here in New York and all around Ground Zero, people just leaving things. And you see very close, could we go back to that just for 1 second? Because if you notice in the foreground, in the ring, in the foreground here, you see they brought pictures again of their kin. And one of the most painful experiences for New Yorkers a year ago today was people, relatives, going all over the city holding pictures of their relatives. Have you seen this man? Have you seen this woman? My husband is lost. And you went everywhere, and they were on railings all around Ground Zero, and they were on railings in the public squares. And by way of tribute today, they have brought them back to put them in that circle of honor at Ground Zero, where there were really moving ceremonies today, and where all of the names were read. Some of them, of course, who died so absolutely heroic. We want to talk, actually, in this half hour about the heroes of September 11th, and there were many of them. I found a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson the other day, who once wrote, "Heroism feels and never reasons, and therefore is always right." And as we know, the tragedy made heroes of hundreds of firefighters and the rescue workers, but there were also many stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, unsung heroes who felt the need to help. We asked our correspondent Michelle Norris to put together a piece on two people. One is a bouncer, and the other is an architect.
It was like a magnet. I was pushed or pulled towards World Trade Center.
I showed them my Red Cross certification card. They said, "Yeah, we need you. Let's go." Get on the truck, and they drove me in.
On the morning of September 11th, most New Yorkers tried to get as far away as possible from the World Trade Center. But Mike Ballone and Yershi Bodnik had the opposite instinct.
I heard a lot about you.
Both men fought to reach Ground Zero, desperate to help. Mike Ballone, a 300-pound nightclub bouncer from Brooklyn, hitched a ride into Manhattan on a fire truck.
That was my goal. I wanted to pull one person out alive.
In another part of Brooklyn, Yershi Bodnik saw the inferno from a construction site. An architect and structural engineer, he immediately recognized that the towers were likely to topple.
My reaction was to just grab my hard hat, and I took a portable radio, flashlight, and started walking across Brooklyn Bridge.
At Ground Zero, Bodnik joined rescue workers and civilian volunteers, sifting through the rubble with their bare hands.
We were finding nothing but expired bodies and body parts and all kinds of stuff I never seen before.
Mike Ballone threw himself into the rescue effort, a big man who turned out to be a big asset.
The firemen that I came in with, they said, "Mike, what we really need you to do, since you're a pretty big guy, is we're going to need you to come in with us and just help us lift the girders to see who we can find." And that's what I did. I just started lifting up beams and helping them jump into the voids, into the holes where the windows used to be.
Hello? The work was both grueling and gruesome, but Ballone couldn't imagine being anywhere else.
And he saw a lot of things which a lot of people haven't seen in their lifetime. And he helped. He didn't flinch. He stayed there right through.
Balone quickly became an indispensable volunteer. He learned how to operate heavy excavation tools. He was the fixer.
I call him the angel of the pit because his answer to anything you need done is no problem.
Iron Man. Mike is the Iron Man of the Trade Center.
During 9 months of recovery and cleanup, Balone never left the pit for more than a few hours. On Saturday nights, he faithfully returned to Brooklyn,
Hi, D-Gross.
reporting for work at the Legacy Disco. But the rest of the week belonged to Ground Zero. Balone even slept just steps from the site in St. Paul's Church.
I would rather sleep on the pew than the cot. The cot was too comfortable. If I slept in the pew, I would only get a couple of hours sleep. So this way I would get back up without any problem.
Along the way, he found a new family, adopted by the tight brotherhood of grieving New York firefighters.
I guess you get a medal or a statue. I mean, there's a lot of people that should get medals and statues. But, you know, he was special.
I got a chance to make and to work with the greatest men on earth, who hold down the greatest job on earth, fire department. Those guys, man, I love them.
Balone's sheer brawn served him well in the pit, but things were different for Jerzy Bodnik. A Czechoslovakian immigrant who defected to America 15 years ago, Bodnik was determined to help a city he'd come to love. He simply lacked the stomach for work in the pit.
There were a ton of people helping with their hands and, you know, looking through the debris, and I thought, how can I help that would really make a difference?
With his architectural training, Bodnik realized what rescue workers needed most, a visual tool to spot stairwells, elevator shafts, air pockets.
So I knew that we shouldn't be just kind of randomly looking through this pile of debris. We should locate and exactly pinpoint the areas where survivors can still, you know, be alive.
Bodnik remembered that his college, Cooper Union, kept a set of detailed plans for Lower Manhattan in the school's library. The problem, the school, like most of Manhattan, was closed. So he tracked down the college president at home.
On Saturday morning, following September 11th, I was in my house, which is right down the street, in my bathrobe, and, you know, in the midst of this tension and so on, and the bell rings, and there's a stranger at my door.
And he says, "Who are you?" So I showed him my pass, and I said, "I'm Jerzy Bodnik, and I need your help."
It was very intense, very eager, very enthusiastic, and was clearly a man with a mission.
With plans in hand, Bodnik constructed an architectural model that helped rescue workers make sense of the mountain of debris.
He put together first a cardboard model to help people understand what was both above ground and what was also below ground.
But he still wanted to do more, so he quit his engineering job to create a project called Brainstorm. The goal? Build a three-dimensional model of Ground Zero using computer animation.
It was just total mess. Can you imagine 70 feet of debris pile? And so this model kind of helped to orientate everybody.
Through site visits and countless interviews with rescue workers, Bodnik and his team created a stunning visual tool to pinpoint danger zones.
Recreating the site and showing, okay, here you can't walk, or here you can't place a crane or any equipment.
The model, for instance, helped Ground Zero construction workers avoid a deadly mistake.
And what would happen if they were to just pull this building away is this wall would then start to fall down and start causing problems for some of the lower floors that were down below there. There was lots of firemen that were down there looking for other firemen or any survivors, and they could have all been killed by these falling slabs.
Bodnik developed the 3D model hoping that it would help find survivors. There were none, but it did protect against a further loss of life.
It's an amazing feat, and to be able to say that all that was done without another fatality is amazing.
Even though the recovery effort is officially over, both men maintain strong ties to Ground Zero. Bodnik is fine-tuning his computer model to help other cities prepare for disaster.
And we don't want to have another situation where everybody's running around and like we have no set of plans.
Balone, meanwhile, talks to school children about September 11th.
That's what helped us. Your cards and letters, your support.
And he has earned a new title, Safety Director for the New York Fire Department. Both men are too modest to call their work heroic, but those who labored alongside them see it quite differently. Michelle Norris, ABC News, New York.
I want to meet two people now who've been sitting here watching this piece. On my immediate right is Fred Eichler, who was the senior vice president at Accelera. Accelera. Yes. Company's gone out of business since 9/11, but yes. Fred got off the 83rd floor, and next to him, Jonathan Judd, who actually had his office on the 85th floor, working for a law firm, but was in an elevator and got out at the 83rd floor. And first of all, we're just very grateful both of you have come. I'll ask you about that, but I just wonder, you know, I was just sitting here watching out of the corner of my eye the Michelle Norris report, and I noticed you were too. How do you feel when you watch all this stuff on television, these recreations, other people talking about it, Jonathan?
It's a little overwhelming. I mean, you are constantly reliving what happened, but somehow I've managed to deal with it pretty well. Somehow, I think it's because it's so enormous that it just has never completely sunk in.
Are there any benefits to reliving it as often as you've been obliged to? Except one benefit, surely, is the fact that you survived it.
Well, that's there's no doubt about that. But I think it's good on an anniversary like this that so many people have been calling me and emailing me and showing so much support, and that's really therapeutic. And that happened immediately after this occurred as well. So I'm really thankful to all those people.
Fred?
Basically feel the same. Today has been a tougher day than I expected. But, I mean, over the year, it's been difficult to try to get away from it, especially living in New York. You're constantly reminded of, you know, the attack and everything else.
And who you are as part of our history.
Absolutely.
Today was tougher. I'm not the slightest bit surprised, but tell us why.
Just reliving what had happened. One of the events of that day was I actually saw the plane hit the building.
I know you did. Just amazed.
And as soon as it hit, our corridor became an inferno, and we were trapped in our office. And right about that time, my wife called, my parents called, and my daughter Michelle called. And I never told them what the situation really was, but I honestly thought that's going to be the last time I'm going to speak to them. So, you know, that's been flashing through my mind pretty often today.
Jonathan, you both got out of the 83rd floor in the North Tower, and not a lot of people got out from that high up. Do you mind telling us how?
Would you like me to start with how?
I'd like you to start wherever you feel comfortable.
Okay. Well, I was in an elevator. I worked on the 85th floor, and on 83, I was kind of leaning against the side of the elevator because I hadn't had much sleep. My daughter, Jordana, was just born 6 weeks before, and she had been up during the night, so I was really out of it, and all of a sudden I heard this whoosh as soon as this person got off on 83, and I looked up and I saw the 3 elevators directly across from me in the same elevator bank were in flames. They exploded, and some of the doors were askew on the elevator shafts. If I had been in one of those, I probably would have died instantly. True. And I ran immediately for the first place where I didn't see any fire, which was Fred's office. And people later asked me, why didn't you try to run right out the stairway? Well, you couldn't, because the entire lobby area was on fire, and I didn't want to go anywhere near there. So I ran in, and that's how I met Fred, the hard way.
And Fred, how did you guys find the stairway?
Well, we were trapped in our office for, it turns out, about 45 minutes, until about 9:30. But backing up about 15 minutes, when what we now know was the second plane, when that hit, we didn't know what it was. And we heard this massive explosion, and we thought the floors above us were caving in on us. At that point, we did try to get out, and the sprinkler system had doused the flames somewhat in the lobby. And we started...
This is in the lobby on 83?
On 83, right outside our front doors. And as we were walking to what we believed was the stairwell, and we got probably maybe 5 feet from it, and then all the lights went out. And we could not see whether it was a stairwell, a closet, or anything else. So we said, well, we're going to go back to our office and hopefully be rescued. Basically, the decision was go back and either be rescued or die.
And you were rescued, Jonathan?
Yes. Yeah.
How?
It was a miracle as far as I'm concerned. After waiting there for quite a long time, we were in an office where there were glass doors, thankfully, because there was so much smoke out in the hallway. We finally saw these two beams of light shining, and the two people came with flashlights and said, "Get out of here right now, leave everything, and let's go." And I never knew who they were, but Fred told me that one was a fireman and one was a Port Authority officer, and they continued on their way up trying to help other people, so I don't believe that they made it out.
But it was, as I know, Fred, because of the glass door, and you saw the policeman's flashlight.
Yes, I saw
Other people behind other doors did not see the flashlight.
I saw the beam of light, and as Jonathan said, they came into our office. They said, drop whatever you have. And the stairwell from 83 to 78 was absolutely treacherous. And in fact, I almost slipped 2 or 3 times. And we got to the 78th floor, went through the lobby, the door into the skylight.
78th floor of the North Tower is where there is basically a lobby where a lot of the elevators in the North Tower actually converge, and it was beyond belief at that point.
There were some people in it, you know, and then we walked along the elevator bank to the other end of the building and started our way down from 78. We got to the 5th floor, and the whole stairwell filled up with smoke. And at that point, we were stopped for, I don't know, could have been 10 minutes, and we were taken to another stairwell where we waited. And then the fire department split the group up. Some went back to the original stairwell, and some stayed at the new one. And we got down to the lobby, and I know I walked out of the building about 4 minutes before it collapsed.
You know, it's true. I feel very self-conscious about imposing on you both today, Jonathan. And it's true. We all want to hear your stories over.
I'd rather tell the story than the alternative.
Yeah, and we want to hear your story over and over again. When you finally got, just last question for you. When you finally got to the bottom, what was it like?
Well, I came out in what was the lobby at one point, but I didn't recognize it. There was no chrome, no glass, no marble. It looked like Hiroshima. That's what it looked like. And I couldn't believe it. And I said to myself, if the plane crashed so high up, how could the lobby look like this? And I didn't know that the other tower came down. That must have been the reason why it looked like that. But never in my wildest dreams did I think that that could even happen. It didn't even cross my mind. So everybody was yelling, run out, run out. And there was a big beam coming out of the wall, swinging. And everyone was saying, run, run. And I said, the beam's going to hit me. There was a woman there wearing high-heeled shoes, and she said, I can't even walk on this, much less run. And I grabbed her arm, I dragged her across the lobby, and we got out through a broken window on the bottom.
Thank you very much, both of you. I know that, I just tell the audience, both Fred and Jonathan have participated in a project which we have done with USA Today, which is, I think, probably the most accurate, most precise recollection of what it was like in the building on the day. And so we're going to see you both again this evening. But I hope it's helped today to tell. Is it helped to tell the story?
Yes.
Yeah. As you said, the alternative is so horrific. And thank you, Jonathan, very much. Thank you, Fred, both of you.
Thank you.
Wish your families well. Fred Eichler and Jonathan Judd. And they're going to participate with us on tape tonight, on this program tonight in our primetime coverage. And they're both quite stunning. So much of that day, in fact, we began with them talking about meeting each other and staying in touch, having lunch, becoming friends. So much of that day was about people trying to find family and friends and children in all of this chaos and the confusion that we could only watch at a distance. There were, of course, quiet heroes who protected and comforted other people, including the children, until they were reunited with their parents. This is a story that will bring back memories for a lot of us because we watched it at a distance on that day. Amy sees Jamie Floyd on the children at the daycare center that morning in the shadow of the Twin Towers.
These are the images teachers remember most of the Children's Discovery Daycare Center at 5 World Trade Center, not 100 yards from the Twin Towers, before their innocent worlds came crashing down.
I remember looking outside, and all I see is just debris and the earth. It just felt like it was the best way that I could describe it. It just felt like we were about to be swallowed.
But Karen Caicedo and the other teachers didn't panic.
You had to act, and you had to act fast. We scoop up the children and head out.
The official evacuation plan would have taken them northwest to 7 World Trade Center, towards the danger. Number 7 collapsed later that day. Instead, on instinct, they moved east, then north, traveling close to 3 miles, one teacher barefoot. They carried the babies, the toddlers running to keep up.
We said we have to run. Whatever you do, run. We'll pick you up. If you fall, we'll pick you up.
They borrowed shopping carts to ferry the children through the narrow streets of lower Manhattan.
The debris that was falling, we were just never far enough, and these men took their shirts off their back to give to our children, to cover them.
After walking for hours, they stumbled into this Head Start program, now safe but anxious as the waiting began. Some of the parents worked in the towers.
That's all I was thinking, we'll take them in, that's it. Whether we could or not, that's it, those are our babies. They would never, ever become orphans.
The parents had no way to know that their children were safe and every reason to expect the worst. Art Chang raced downtown on this subway line, but never made it to Ground Zero.
The train ground to a halt, and it sat there, and it sat there, and it sat there.
Phil Sears worked a mile away on Wall Street. He ran all the way to the daycare center.
People were actually yelling at me, too, as I was going the other way, saying, don't go that way, don't go that way.
As the parents frantically searched for their children, the police put the word out that the little ones were safe.
We could have burst in here, and I think without exception, every child was asleep under a fluffy blanket on a little cot in this room, and they looked so peaceful.
By evening, all the families were reunited. Not one child orphaned, not one parent or teacher lost.
Hi.
Hi,
Daddy. Nearly a year after the terrorist attacks, we showed them photos of what happened to their daycare center.
This was our room.
They are still haunted by the experience.
When he hears helicopters, he seems to get upset. All the noise and chaos, probably, that reminds him of it.
Since September 11th, Karen Caicedo has spent her days babysitting for one of the children she saved, Ben Chang. Ben's father, Art, was so inspired by the teachers, he's decided to start a daycare center of his own.
Teachers like Karen are people that you can just never forget about, and that they're so valuable, and really they themselves are as priceless as our children.
His new daycare center will open in fall 2003. Maybe Karen Caicedo will be back amongst the children there. Jamie Floyd, ABC News, New York.
A lovely story in the final analysis, as it was earlier talking to Fred Eichel and to Jonathan Judd as well. As one of them said when they were leaving, just so good to be here telling you the story. We've actually heard so many remarkable stories in preparation for this broadcast. We've heard them all year and perhaps not focused on them as much as we might have, but so many stories about how people were able to make it out of the 2 buildings under the most difficult circumstances. One young man actually caught our attention because he's one of those who very much chose to put the lives of others ahead of his own. A selflessness that was very evident in so many places that day. But with his story, here's ABC's Judy Muller.
Michael Wright, a telecommunications salesman, works in a high-rise office building in Manhattan. His days seem fairly routine.
Can you let him know that Michael Wright from Focal, just returning his phone call?
But for Michael, no day will ever be routine again. On September 11th, his former company was located on the 81st floor of No. 1 World Trade Center. At 8:48 that morning, he happened to be in the restroom.
When it hit, it was so loud and so percussive and so close by that the only thing I thought it could be would be a gas main or something like that blowing up.
And then he looked out the restroom door.
Elevator bank between where our bathroom was and the office had blown out, and there were flaming chunks of material all over.
The 30 or so employees from his office were staggering into the hallway.
And I was just screaming, get out, stairways are that way. They were stunned, and obviously various, some people were crying, some people were in shock, some people
really didn't know what was going on.
Nobody knew what was going on.
No one knew what was going on.
As they made their way down the stairwell from the 81st floor, they were joined by others.
We saw people come down who were burned. You know, some of them fairly severely, but, you know, nothing to lead me to believe the gravity of what had occurred.
In fact, says Michael, it almost felt like a fire drill until they got their first hint of what had happened.
As we were walking down, there was a gentleman with a BlackBerry, and he was the first to tell us that a plane had hit the building. And in my mind's eye, I was picturing a Cessna.
Almost everyone, he says, was trying to call home. Michael's wife, Jenny, and 5-month-old son, Ben, were visiting his parents in Boston. Getting in touch with them became his primary focus.
My cell phone was at my desk, so that did me no good. I tried everyone's cell phone around me, but I just wasn't able to get through.
And then came word that a plane had crashed into World Trade Center number 2 next door.
Yeah, I never heard the second plane hit. I heard from the same gentleman who had the BlackBerry that the second plane had hit, though.
And then they knew it had to be a terrorist attack, and that it might not be over. About halfway down on the 40th floor, they started running into firemen coming up the stairs.
One, you know, individuals in particular, I can still picture his face, and you could tell he knew damn well what he was going into, and it frightened him.
Do you wonder what happened to him?
I have a pretty good idea.
Didn't get out.
I can't imagine he did.
A rescue worker asked if anyone in the stairwell knew CPR and would be willing to escort the weak and elderly down the stairs. Michael volunteered.
When we'd escort people down a number of flights of stairs, and we were the last 2 to leave the stairwell because we stayed back and we waited a few minutes, and then it was obvious that no one else was coming down. So
It never occurred to you that those minutes might mean the difference between life and death for you?
No.
Not until he exited the stairs at the mezzanine level did he begin to really understand.
At that point, I looked out and I saw out onto the plaza, and that's when I knew sort of the gravity of...
What did you see?
I saw, you know, fire, I saw body parts, I saw, you know, I saw the human toll. As soon as I realized the stuff I didn't want to see, I put my hands up to my eyes, and I stopped looking. I was running for the escalator. At that point, there were some people coming out of another stairwell, and I was screaming, "Don't look outside. Don't look outside."
The images of those dismembered bodies in the plaza between the 2 towers, he says, will haunt him forever.
Unlike some people who kind of watch it from afar, I have no ability to distance myself from those people, because those people could be me. That could have been a decision I had to make.
Such thoughts, he says, would come later. He was too overwhelmed at the time by a terrifying reflection in the windows of the hotel next door.
The first thing I saw was glass coming down, raining down, and then I saw in the reflection of the Millennium Hotel, the building actually collapsing.
It was a reflection of tower number 2, the second building to be hit, but the first to collapse. It made a rumble so horrific that Michael still cannot find words to describe it.
The noise was like nothing. You know, how do you describe a 110-story building coming down in the context that anyone can understand? It was coming down right in front of me. There was really nothing. You know, all I did at that point was I dove on the ground near a big pillar and, you know, just thought of my wife and baby, and just, you know, hopes that someone would take care of them, that they would be okay, because I didn't think I was going to get out. There was an explosion in my face that was so severe with the material that it packed my mouth and my nose and my ears. A little kid packs a pail of sand.
He escaped serious injury, but he was trapped in the pitch dark in an enclosed area filled with smoke.
And I was just crawling aimlessly, just thinking, you know, this is what it's going to be like to, you know, asphyxiate to death.
And then an incredible bit of luck. He saw the beam of a flashlight. It was in the hands of a fireman.
I figured my best chances of getting out was with him. You know, he had a radio, he had a spotlight, he had an axe.
The fireman was able to break a window into Borders bookstore, one of many shops under the World Trade Center. They groped their way through the dark store to the outside.
Thank goodness, you know, that beam of light was the difference between despair and hope. But, you know, in terms of people are like, you know, if you saw him on the street, would you know him? No, I don't think so.
Did you ever find out who he was?
No.
Once outside, Michael started to run, fearful the attack might still be underway.
I ran, and I heard a noise very similar, which was the other tower coming down. At that point, I just started running.
His wife, Jenny, had no idea Michael was alive. In fact, a phone call from her father led her to believe the worst.
I spoke to my dad, and I'd heard that Tower 2 had collapsed, and I said, but Dad, I know Tower 2 collapsed, but that's not Michael's. And he said they both collapsed.
Michael headed north towards New York University, where his brother works. Along the way, he ran into a construction worker named Gary.
He said, what can I do for you? And I said, call my wife. She's at my parents' house in Boston.
When Michael reached NYU, he was finally able to reach his wife himself.
And it was just, you know, we were both screaming, crying. Just, you know, I'm alive, I'm alive.
She was saying, I love you, I love you, I love you. And I was saying, I'm okay, I'm okay. And we cried, and before we could even really say anything, the phone cut out. But I heard her voice, which was, you know, something I'd never heard her voice, you know, in terms of what she sounded like. You know, when I said, it's Michael, the sound that came out of her was, I don't know, something I hope never to hear again.
It was only then, after the relief of reaching his wife, that Michael became aware of the excruciating pain in his eyes. He was taken to the hospital, where they washed out 147 shards of fiberglass and bandaged his eyes. His brother picked him up and led Michael to his home in Brooklyn.
And as soon as I stepped into my apartment is when it all hit me. And I just physically collapsed. And I was, you know, just let it all out there, like, uncontrollably. It was like, that was when I finally, as soon as I felt safe, is when I finally kind of let go of everything I'd experienced that day.
Michael was soon reunited with Jenny. Because his eyes were still bandaged, he could not see her.
And she handed me my son, and he was making those happy, wiggly noises that babies make, so I knew he was happy, and it felt so good to hold him.
Hey, buddy! Michael commutes to and from the city now, from a bucolic town north of Manhattan.
Come here, buddy.
An ordinary commuter with an extraordinary sense of gratitude.
You realize how lucky you are in a lot of ways. Not lucky in that I escaped a horrible day. I'm lucky in that I had this life to be able to look at. You know, I'm lucky because I had these things before I ever stepped foot in that building.
Judy Muller, ABC News, New York.
Another wonderful story. You know, before all this began, people had a lot of discussion about what kind of stories would people want to hear today, what kind of stories would survivors want to tell, what kind of stories would help people get through, what would not be exploitive, etc. And there's a moment in that report from Judy Muller where Michael says he has never been able to find the firefighter who helped him through the Borders bookstore underneath and got him out to the street, no matter how hard he's tried. One of the really interesting things the last year is how many people have ended up being connected because their story has been in the public, either in the newspaper or on television or radio, and they've made connections that they would not have simply on their own. We will be back in just a moment. First, just a quick glimpse at what they are doing at some of the firehouses in the city in memory of those more than 300 firefighters who were lost. In a firehouse, the riding board is the list of names and responsibilities of firefighters who've gone out on a job. On September 11th, many who wrote their names in chalk never returned. Several riding boards from that day have been preserved. Boards from Engine Company 22 and Ladder Company 13 were wrapped in blankets and taken to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They have helped to preserve them forever.
remembering the significance of this day. Lots of flag waving coming from kids at the Lutheran School on North Broadway. About 200 students, preschool through 8th grade, paid tribute to the heroes and to the victims. Parents and others donated the flags. The students waved them at cars and at people walking by. The effects of 9/11 stretched across the world. Coming up in about 5 minutes, we'll show you how other countries remembered America's tragedy.
Well, the American Red Cross chose this day to dedicate its new Safety Education Center at Safety City. The new center is fully equipped so that kids can learn about safety issues, about first aid, and how to respond to emergencies. The new center will help the Red Cross in its training classes. Last year, more than 30,000 people were trained in similar facilities. I was out in the Carnes community earlier this evening, and absolutely beautiful weather there.
Just gorgeous weather here in East Tennessee, and as we noticed from the pictures in New York, a bit windy there today.
A bit windy, and part of those winds were partially due to the same cold front that came through us, and partially due to Hurricane Gustav that slid off the coast of Manhattan, is now well out into the Atlantic, so no threats to the U.S. We have high pressure and control here, so Storm Tracker keeps us dry this evening. You're looking in on Rutledge and part of Granger County, also Morristown to Alpha and Talbot, Cherokee Lake dividing the two counties of Granger County and Morristown. It will continue to be, or Hamlin County that is, it will continue to be dry there tonight and through the next couple of days, as will be the case throughout East Tennessee. We've dropped to 72 degrees, humidity up to 64%, a rising barometer, and a northeast breeze at 2. No precipitation today, no precipitation in the forecast tomorrow. There could be some before the weekend is out, but the great news is that temperatures stay under control, should we say over the next few days. We'll get you details on that in just a few minutes.
And other news of the day coming up, another election debacle in Florida. Democrat Janet Reno may challenge last night's vote in court. And some East Tennessee students unite to form a human flag. First, an example of how East Tennesseans say they've changed since last year.
Well, everything is different. Can't get on the plane like you used to, and every time you see a plane, you're wondering if it's going to be a bomb heading towards another building or anything.
It's like things are never the same anymore. It's a new world, and I think it's woken us all up that we can't take certain things for granted, like the way we live and freedom.
Welcome back. More 9/11 coverage for you in just a moment. First, though, here we go again, another election debacle, and again, it's in Florida. Bill McBride holds a narrow lead over former Attorney General Janet Reno. Only about 11,000 votes separate the two. Questions tonight from the Reno camp because a glitch in the new electronic voting machines kept several hundred people from voting. Last night, both candidates celebrated premature victories. Reno thanked her supporters and acknowledged that she was closing the gap between herself and McBride. Her opponent also predicted victory. Bill McBride said he's nervous, but said Republican Jeb Bush has the most to be jittery about. Bush will face the Democratic winner in the general election.
Union County students chose a special way to remember today's anniversary. About 780 children created a human flag outside of Horace Maynard Middle School. 7th and 8th graders created the red and white stripes. 6th graders filled in with the blue.
They think just because we're kids, we can't make a big difference, but we really can. And we're just doing it to show that we do care about what has happened a year ago.
A digital picture of the human flag will eventually be put onto a plaque in the school's lobby.
This anniversary of the attack on America was the occasion for solemn memorials across the world, from Europe to the Mideast to the Southern Hemisphere. They took time to remember. Here's ABC's Adora Udoji.
New Zealand was the first country to usher in September 11th. They marked it with a moment of silence, commemorating the deaths of 3,025 people. In dozens of countries, they continue to mourn their own.
We grieve for the families of those 10 Australians who died.
From one time zone to the next, world leaders led their citizens in honoring the victims. Many people prayed,
in death and in life,
or laid wreaths. From the Vatican, Pope John Paul II said, such grave offenses against human life can never be justified. And so, U.S. troops in Afghanistan continue the fight against terror, but paused to remember. The gestures came from all over. Israel joined in the round-the-world 24-hour chorus of Mozart's Requiem. By tomorrow morning, it will have been played from Australia, Asia, Africa, Europe, South and North America, in memory of victims of a terrorist attack that left no country untouched. Adora Udoji, ABC News, London.
Well, the sun set on New York City just a couple of hours ago, but take a look at this. A peaceful sunrise over Manhattan this morning. From this view, the sun appeared right where the Twin Towers once stood. Today's weather in New York was almost identical to September 11th of last year.
And that's one image I'll never forget, that stark, beautiful blue sky that we saw over the New York skyline last year. Today, much the same, but the very windy conditions were a culprit of two things. One, Hurricane Gustav that went through the Carolinas and slid out to sea today still had an influence on New York, and also the same cold front that's cooling us down, helping to cool them down as well. It has turned out to be a very nice evening here in East Tennessee. Knoxville and the interstate system all dry, north, south, east, and west, and all of East Tennessee dry. Hopefully we'll be able to get some action on Storm Tracker as we go into the weekend, but not the case right now. It's cooled off nicely. Look at the temperatures in your neighborhood, from 66 from Ken Major and Cosby and Tony Zach in Halls to 64 here in Maynardville, 63 in Middlesboro, 70 from Madisonville to Kingston, and as we look over into Crossville in that area, temperatures have dropped into the middle 60s. Everybody headed into the 50s tonight, and it'll be a beautiful start to your Thursday morning. Here's a instant weather net report from over Gatlinburg, already down to 65 degrees with 65% humidity as well, and it's 68 degrees at Roane State Community College. Light winds will persist during the overnight hours. We do need some precipitation. Nothing for September, nothing for today. 3741 for the year, and look at this. This surplus used to be over 6 to 7 inches earlier in the summer months, but now it has dried out. The wet part to the spring and early summer, well, it has really turned bone dry, and unfortunately I don't see any relief over the next few days. When we get the humidity in here so low too, that also dries things out rapidly. 88 the high today, 66 the low this afternoon, early this morning, and tonight we expect temperatures to go into the low 50s on the plateau and in the mountains. Some mountain areas may drop into the upper 40s, and we'll be in the mid-50s in Knoxville and surrounding counties. Same thing tomorrow night. 6 predictor, tomorrow's weather today in the forecast with clear skies at midnight. As we head into the early morning hours, we should be dry as well. Notice just an increase in moisture by late tomorrow afternoon. That would be in the form of a partly cloudy sky, and that partly cloudy sky will persist overnight. Not expecting any precipitation this go-around. That will probably wait till later in the weekend. Yep, a taste of fall, down to 57 for us in Knoxville tonight. A little cooler in the outlying areas. 84 tomorrow. That 84 sounds wonderful compared to the 95 readings we had earlier this week. We'll also have light winds and low humidity with a sunrise at 716. Here we are as we go through the next 6 days. Mid to upper 50s Thursday and Friday morning. We'll warm into the low to mid 80s, and then should be in the low to mid 80s through the weekend. A couple things you'll notice is no 90s in the forecast. Another cold front due in here Saturday night, Sunday, which could bring an increased chance for showers and scattered thunderstorms. We need that. And overnight lows will be in the upper 50s and low 60s. So we've got the near normal temperatures in the cooler air. If we can throw some water on it, I think we'll please everybody this time around.
All right. Well, coming up, the granddaddy of all American flags, one larger than a football field, plus a rare sight at one of the world's busiest airports. First, more reflection as East Tennessee remembers September 11th.
Well, it's certainly made me more appreciative of family. I think it's made us all realize that in a second, your whole life can change. And so I take a little more time each day to tell my parents I love them, my family I love them, and to go out and make each.
Well, airports in Knoxville and across the United States were nearly empty today. Covering America now, beginning at Chicago's O'Hare, one of the world's busiest airports, and this is not something you will see there often. Deserted terminals at some of the nation's busiest airports. For example, Atlanta is used to seeing some 255,000 passengers a day. Today, fewer than 100,000 there. No explosives were found at a state office tower in Ohio, but the man who said he was there to put a bomb in the building is charged with inducing panic. Police dogs detected explosives on a van at the building loading dock. The building was evacuated, but no device was found. And take a look at this flag in San Francisco. It is being called the largest flag in the world. 1,000 people have to hold and refold it. The banner's 255 feet wide, 500 feet long. Now, by comparison, The field at Neyland Stadium, 160 feet wide, 360 feet long. That is a very big flag.
Boy, that is something. Well, Jim is here, and a local college football team will get a first-hand look at Ground Zero.
But it won't happen this weekend.
It will happen this weekend. Actually, they'll play Saturday up in New Haven, Connecticut, and get a chance to view the site up there on Friday. It's a tough day for pro football fans. One of the greatest ever to lace up a pair of high-top sneakers has passed away as well. We'll talk about Johnny Unitas and the Carson Newman football team next. Well, they'll play a football game Saturday in New Haven, Connecticut, but the Carson Newman Eagles will have much more than football on their minds when they head north this weekend. The Eagles spent this afternoon at practice, but found out from head coach Ken Sparks the entire team will visit Ground Zero Friday morning. When they fly to New York for the game, it could be a life-adjusting trip.
You know, I hope that it's a challenging experience. I hope it's one of those things that challenges all of us to be better people, be better Americans, be better Christians. It's, you know, to be able to go into New York at this particular time in our country and to go at that particular place, I think it gives us a great opportunity to get a good lesson.
Firefighters and police, when they went in and gave their lives knowing they may not come out, just that experience of the sacrifice they made for fellow Americans and fellow brothers and sisters.
Eagles do plan to visit some other New York City sites, including Yankee Stadium, but the trip to the attack site will indeed be the most profound. This is newborn baby Lexi. Her dad is Seymour High School baseball coach Brian McCord, who was home after serving military duty in Afghanistan. His trip there came after and in response to the 9/11 attacks.
The first plane had already hit, and we actually saw the second plane hit. I knew then that he was going to have to go. I wasn't sure when, but I knew that he was going to have to. And it was real scary.
Anybody tells you they ever go off to war and they're not scared, you better check them mentally, you know, because if you're not scared, something's wrong with you. You better be scared, because that's what keeps you on your heightened alert and make sure you do it. It's what you do when you're scared is what's the difference.
Brian missed all of last baseball season while serving in the war zone halfway around the world. He will be back as an Eagle baseball coach for the coming season. His team is glad about that. His wife and baby are just glad to have him home. He was arguably the best quarterback in NFL history. Hall of Famer Johnny Unitas passed away today after suffering a heart attack in the city where he made his name famous, Baltimore. Unitas was the definitive player of his generation and helped take pro football into its modern era. Despite that, Johnny U maintained a classic throwback look with the trademark high-top football shoes and the crew cut to go with it.
It was really an exciting player. I mean, the things that Baltimore did, you know, he'd throw the ball downfield. At the time, they didn't do much of that.
I always have this image of that long throwing motion, you know, that he had. It wasn't that real quick darting motion, but that long sweeping motion that he used.
Unitas was 69. He set the original standard for other NFL quarterbacks to follow. He retired in 1973 with 22 NFL records, 3 NFL championships, and 3 Most Valuable Player awards. The Braves doing the 2-for-1 thing today, a doubleheader against the New York Mets, and they just keep hitting the home runs. Atlanta with 5 in last night's game, and Chipper says, I want into the act as well. This one going to left, a 3-run shot in the third makes it 3-0. And for this, we give him the Jimmy in the 8th inning, a runner on, Chipper going to right. 2 home runs in one game. Smoltz got his 50th save. Atlanta wins the game 8-5. Good Jimmy award right there. 2 home runs in one game. They just keep hitting home runs left and right, this team does.
They keep doing it in the playoffs.
Let's hope so.
Well, we'll be right back as you take a live look at Ground Zero.
New York lottery officials drew for the evening lottery just a few hours ago, and a most coincidental series of numbers popped up. You guessed it, the winning numbers for tonight's New York lottery, 911. A lottery spokeswoman says they picked the numbers the same way they always do, and it will be tomorrow before they know how many people won with those numbers.
Because you got to know, a lot of people chose 911.
But isn't that amazing?
It is. It is.
Other amazing numbers are 50s. I mean,
yeah, we like those better.
There. I'll take that anytime. Wish I could have the jackpot to go along with it, but that's not the case. We'll be in the low to mid 50s in the morning. Sunrise temperature, sunrise at 7:16, clear and cool, and we're only in the low to mid 80s through the next 6 days. Very enjoyable weather.
All right. Well, if you're like most people, you certainly remember exactly what you were doing this time last year.
So we leave you with a look back to that September day. Good night, everybody.
Where were you when the world stopped turning that September day? Were you in the yard with your wife and children working on some stage in L.A.? Did you stand there in shock at the sight of that black smoke rising against that blue sky? Did you shout out in anger and fear for your neighbor? Or did you just sit down and cry? Did you?
At Recreational Factory Warehouse, when we say
less raw.
Her last words to me were, "We're all running to first class. I've got to go. Bye."
And I told him I loved him. And he said, "We're going to do something." And he hung up. And he never called back.
I heard commotion and screams and hollers of terror. I could hear men hollering and women screaming in the background.
And that would be the last anyone would hear from aboard United Flight 93.
They decide to keep it simple. All the photos will be copied on basic printers. The pictures will be sold to the public at $25 each. The proceeds donated to a charity for children who have suffered as a result of 9/11.
I'm buying a few remembrances for family members for Christmas that won't be able to come here and see this in person. And it's pretty disturbing. I have to fight back the tears in here.
I was in the World Trade Center when the plane hit, and I work a quarter mile away, so I watched both of the buildings collapse. So this is sort of like coming to the wake of a good friend.
Every day people walking in with astonishing pictures. This is a heartbreaking picture. See a woman here in the hull. This is the shape of the plane. This is the hole the plane made. You can see this tiny woman here. This is exactly what the Taliban hated about our culture. I mean, they had laws against photography. Individual expression was something they tried to squelch in their culture. And this is exactly what they wanted to destroy.
On the morning of September 11th, Tim Thornsberry was working at the Hoffman coal mine outside Shanksville, Pennsylvania.
Out of the corner of my eye, I picked something up, and then I looked, and I seen a plane off to my right.
It was United Flight 93, and it appeared out of control.
Just erratically going back, wings going from side to side as it flew right over top of me. And then as it was veering, it kind of come in at a slight angle like it was going to go into the ground. And then right where that first dirt pile is, it rolled completely upside down and then it continued that way until it got to the tree line.
Housewife Paula Pluta was just finishing breakfast when Flight 93 plummeted past her house.
Like out of nowhere, I heard a very loud, roaring, rumbling noise coming from somewhere. And I didn't know exactly what it was, but it did sound like something was falling from the sky.
Pluta went out to her porch.
I saw basically just a silver streak coming and nosediving to the ground, and then a huge explosion. The actual explosion was a huge fireball, and there's a tree line separating me from the site, and the fireball was about 100 feet above the treetops.
At the same time, those who had been speaking with the passengers just before the crash clung to the line, desperate for news.
I stayed on the phone for a few minutes hoping that, but it went dead.
I held the phone for about 15 minutes, kept the line open, and I kept calling his name. No one came to the phone. About 10 minutes later, we heard over the radio that the plane United 93 had just crashed in Pittsburgh.
Pennsylvania police and emergency rescue teams were called. They had no idea what plane this was, but they raced to the location. An alert also went out to Somerset County Coroner Wallace Miller.
You have to understand that we're going through this area inch by inch.
He hurried to the scene, an abandoned strip mine. When he arrived, he couldn't believe his eyes.
It looked like someone had gouged about a 10-foot wide, 10-foot deep trough through the strip mine area. But when you looked in, it was just covered with dirt. There was nothing there that you could really say it was an airplane. There were just smoking things, pieces of aircraft, just small pieces everywhere.
The voice data recorder was recovered
By the time FBI spokesman Bill Crowley arrived on the scene, it was clear that this scattered debris was all that was left of UAL-93. Working with so little evidence and with so little time, federal investigators narrowed their objectives.
Initially, the primary goal was to get two things. One was the flight data recorder and also the cockpit voice recorder. We believe that those two pieces of evidence were going to give us the best opportunity to determine what occurred on the plane prior to it going down.
The big questions facing investigators were, what exactly happened in the final minutes of Flight 93? What made the plane veer so wildly? Who was in control? And why did it nosedive into the ground? The answers may be revealed in the cockpit voice recorder, which has yet to be made public. So far, it has only been played for families of the victims. Those who have heard the tape believe that the passengers did fight back. Some of the families told New York Times reporter and author Jerry Longman what they heard.
At one point, the hijackers discussed shutting off the oxygen supply to the cabin, that it would keep the passengers from coming forward if they couldn't breathe. But they were inexperienced pilots, and they didn't know what they were doing, basically. Below 10,000 feet, it would not have affected the passengers' ability to breathe. It might have been stuffy in the cabin, but they could have breathed fine.
Those who have studied UAL-93's last moments believe the hijackers lost control as they fought with the passengers.
At 9:58, 5 minutes before the crash, you begin to hear this final fierce struggle. You can hear screaming in English and Arabic. You hear crashing sounds. It appears to be plates and glass, and from that comes the theory that the passengers were able to get into the cockpit using a food cart as a battering ram.
If the hijackers were flying the airplane and the passengers entered the cockpit, you can almost see in your mind a struggle for control. Maybe the plane moving in a porpoisey, oscillating way. That's very unstable flight.
The hijackers, at one point during the struggle, you can hear them praying. At one point they begin to talk, one asks, should we finish the flight off? And another one says, not yet. And then near the end of the flight you hear, the voices, according to family members, voices that were distant and muffled become louder and clearer. And you hear words like roll it, lift it up, or turn it up, or pull it up, to which the family members have interpreted that to mean an attempt to gain control of the plane.
If they pulled the hijacker out of the seat, let's say, in the struggle,
In that struggle, the control yoke is pushed forward, pulled back, and in the struggle, the airplane just goes out of control.
Just as it is obvious that a violent struggle took place aboard UAL-93, it is also clear that the passengers never gained complete control. It has not been widely reported, but among the passengers was a pilot who, with the help of ground control, might have been able to handle the airliner. Clearly, he never got a chance to do so.
We don't know whether the plane was crashed on purpose or whether just in the chaos of the moment as they were fighting for control of the plane crashed. But we do know it began turning upside down and it was going 575 miles an hour. Near the end of the tape, you hear this really rushing, the sound of rushing wind. Some of the families have described it almost as if a window were being opened.
Yet, even if the plane had not crashed, it probably would never have reached Washington. Earlier that morning, the Pentagon scrambled fighter jets from Langley Air Force Base to protect the capital.
Those fighters from Langley got to the Pentagon after American Airlines Flight 77 hit the Pentagon. But they then began flying what's called combat air patrols, CAP flights over the city of Washington.
If UAL-93 had gotten much closer to the nation's capital, the fighter jets, armed with air-to-air missiles, would have destroyed it.
We now know, because basically the authorities have said it out loud, that had the plane continued toward Washington, they were prepared to make the decision to shoot it down. It would have been an unprecedented act in U.S. aviation. But knowing at that moment in time what they already knew, that 3 planes had crashed into 3 American buildings, they were not going to take a chance that the 4th was going to hit D.C.
But the passengers of Flight 93 saved the Pentagon from making that decision.
We believe those passengers on this jet were absolute heroes, and their actions during this flight were heroic.
But investigators still wanted to know more about the terrorists they had bested. Federal agents fanned out across the globe to uncover clues. They learned that the United States was facing an enemy far more sophisticated and deceptive than they had ever suspected.
This was a very well thought out plan that allowed them to not only avoid detection while they were doing it, but to create incredible problems piecing it together afterward.
We are fairly certain on a number of them.
As authorities attempted to put the tangled pieces together, they found that in many cases they could not even say for sure who these men were.
One of the means they used, which I think was obviously very successful, was using false identities. And we've known, of course, that it's very easy to get false passports, easy to get a driver's license under a false name, a social security number under a false name.
In fact, the identity of one of the hijackers of Flight 93 remained a mystery. The man called Saeed Al-Hamdi had stolen that identity from a Saudi Arabian commercial pilot who was still alive and living in Tunisia. Authorities also discovered a pattern of clandestine communications. The hijackers avoided telephone conversations and anything in writing. The planning of this attack on America took place in person.
The use of face-to-face meetings to convey information would have several functions. Of course, it would mean you trust somebody that you can see, and it's very important, and you leave no trail for the authorities to follow.
Nevertheless, authorities were able to uncover several details about how the attacks were planned. Ziad Al-Jarrah visited Las Vegas in June 2001 and Laurel, Maryland in August. During both trips, he apparently met with members of the terrorist cell that attacked the Pentagon. Investigators also learned that 2 of the terrorists from Flight 93 were regular visitors to the Paterson, New Jersey apartment of Hani Hanjour, the pilot of the plane that hit the Pentagon. 3 weeks after the crash of UAL-93, authorities revealed they had discovered how the hijackers got some of their weapons past security. A knife hidden inside a cigarette lighter had been found at the crash site. One piece of the puzzle that eluded investigators was why there were only 4 hijackers on UAL-93. Each of the other flights that were hijacked that day carried 5. That may have made the difference for Flight 93's hijackers.
The FBI believes there was going to be a fifth person on Flight 93, and the failure of that fifth hijacker to show up probably left the hijackers undermanned. That left 2 in the cockpit and only 2 to maintain the passengers. That proved not to be enough.
What happened to the fifth hijacker? Since the attacks, the investigations have centered around this man, Zacharias Moussaoui. He took flying lessons at this school in Oklahoma. During the summer of 2001, he asked for time at a flight simulator near Minneapolis. When he said he only wanted to learn how to steer, not to take off or to land, instructors became alarmed. They called the FBI, who detained him for questioning. When the FBI discovered passport violations, Moussaoui was arrested. That was in late August, less than 3 weeks before the hijackings.
It was simply too late to get a replacement, and it would have been too risky.
As investigators sifted through the rubble of United Flight 93 and the much wider devastation at the Pentagon and the World Trade Center, one thing became clear. The heroism of the passengers aboard Flight 93 saved hundreds of lives.
One of my coworkers looked up and he said, "What is that plane doing?" We knew it was in the Pentagon area, but we weren't exactly sure where it had crashed. So we put on our sirens and immediately responded to the area. So once we got there, smoke, flames everywhere. And I remember it just felt like everything was moving in slow motion. We were trying to move quick, but it was so unreal that it just felt like I was just moving very slow. You know, wanting to save people, but there's no one to save. So it's pretty tough. Some people call us crazy because we run in while everybody's running out, but it's because we really, truly love what we do.
America is the land of the free and home of the brave.
Proud to be an American, and that's what it's all about, you know?
You know, America has always been the symbol of freedom and patriotism.
The American dream is alive, more now than ever.
My husband's name is Mark Rasweiler. He worked at the World Trade Center in the North Tower on the 100th floor.
I had called up my office to tell them that we hadn't heard from my father yet, and they said, you know, if there's anything we can do, let us know, you know, we'll do whatever we can. I said, actually, if you could scan in my father's photograph, we want to look for him.
Her art department set up this whole flyer in less than an hour, and we had it copied and we were off.
I think the posters stayed on the wall so long because it became a memorial, and I think people didn't want to take those pictures down. They didn't want to forget.
It helped bring some hope to other families, and I'm glad it was able to help.
On September 11th, terrorists tried to change America forever. Well, they succeeded.
My hope for my children down the road is that they'll be able to understand their father and the way he was as a person. In 4 pushes, Patrick was born. I think Bobby's inside pushing the baby out.
My ultimate hope for my children's future is that their father's legacy is not the World Trade Center, but that it's his love for life.
Poignant and inspiring stories of women who lost one love and gave birth to another. Babies of 9/11. Next on TLC.
Flight 93, along with the other hijacked planes that crashed on September 11th, had no survivors. But through the phone conversations the passengers had with their loved ones, it's now known we've been given a new definition of the word hero. And while the country embraced them and mourned for them, their families now had to find ways to move forward without them.
It's pretty tough to think, you know, I had all this planned out and all these dreams set involving Nicole, and now, you know, she's not here. So what do I do now? How do I carry on? It's, I guess, something that I'll just have to, you know, find in myself day by day.
I still feel so much pain and so much grief that I'm almost afraid to make a decision right now about our future, afraid that I'll make the wrong decision.
I have the bittersweet good fortune of having lost my son in a famous and horrible event. My son's passing has been marked by the world, and I'm very grateful to all the people that I've met who have expressed their affection and love for Mark.
Within weeks of the tragedy, memorial services for the heroes of Flight 93 were held all over the country. Friends, family, and politicians came to pay their final respects.
I never knew Mark Bingham, but I wish I had. I know he was a good son and friend, a good rugby player, a good American, and an extraordinary human being.
I want to say that she was a very good mother, and I loved her dearly. And, well, I'm happy because she's in heaven.
At a special memorial at the crash site in Pennsylvania, First Lady Laura Bush, accompanied by Director of Homeland Security Tom Ridge, comforted the grieving families of the victims.
All of us as Americans share in this grief. The burden is greatest, however, for the families, those of you who are with us today. America is learning the names, but you know the people. And you are the ones they thought of in the last moments of life. You're the ones they called and prayed to see again. You're the ones they loved.
Today we gather to remember the brave Americans who died on United Flight 93. And we vow publicly that our nation will never forget their names.
Long after the memorials are over, the families of the victims will still be in mourning. But they'll never forget how their loved ones reached out to them in those final phone calls, and what the passengers did in the last moments of Flight 93.
I believe that Mark was being calm, and he loved his family more than anything, and he had the opportunity to one time tell us again, even though we knew it. I think he was saying goodbye to us, knowing that what his actions perhaps were going to do were going to be the end.
I would call him a hero. I think what he did and what the others did was very admirable. And if anyone is deserving of that term, they are.
I think everybody on that flight was a hero. You know, there was a handful that got to call their relatives or talk to someone. But yes, they were all heroes, and they kept that airplane from going any further than it did.
Properly, that's illegal.
This is the area, and that's, yeah, those are bullets.
Okay, this is the bag, the suspect bag.
What airline the bag belongs to? United
That's
Airlines?
United.
The screeners call United Airlines to page the passenger and bring him down to the baggage room. They use a residue analyzer to test the outside of the bag for traces of gunpowder or explosives. This machine uses a rapid chemical analysis to identify explosive substances.
Machine analyzing. Remove the sample trap, and the machine says there's no alarm.
The bag tests negative. When the passenger arrives, screeners open the bag. The gun turns out to be a harmless replica. The system worked well this time, but if the gun had been on a domestic flight, it might have gone undetected. Because in San Francisco and in the rest of the nation before 9/11, explosive detection had been focused almost entirely on international flights. Bags on domestic flights were only rarely checked for bombs. No X-ray and no explosive detection.
Then I need to ask you security questions.
The only thing mandated by the FAA was a set of questions.
Have all of your bags been in your control since you packed them? And has anyone you don't know given you anything to take on board the flight? No. Thank you.
People have the feeling that when the baggage goes behind the ticket counter, that there's a machine and it's looking at it and says, there's a bomb here or there's no bomb here. That doesn't happen. It happens only in about 5% of the cases and very crudely.
An FAA computer profiling system selected about 5% of domestic bags for additional screening. But that's not enough to be a real deterrent to terrorists, according to experts.
After Lockerbie, we had a big emphasis on explosive detection systems, but the demand waned as they saw the government wasn't really serious about mandating it.
Now the government may finally be getting serious. Since terrorists used domestic flights on September 11th, the newly formed TSA is rewriting all baggage regulations. Airports are now mandated to check every bag, both domestic and international, through an explosive detection system. But the systems take a long time to manufacture. Security experts doubt they can be put into place in time.
By December 2002, every bag that goes into the hold of an airplane has to be checked by an explosive detection device. I don't think there's any way to do that. I don't think we can build enough machines. I don't think we can put them at airports quickly enough.
We are very confident in our ability to deploy these explosive detection systems at our airports by the deadline.
In the meantime, the main new defense against bombs checked on domestic flights is bag matching. Bag matching means no bag goes on a plane until the owner has boarded.
The basic security measure, which is still in place as of this date, is the positive passenger bag match. That has been done for international flights, but it wasn't always being done on domestic flights.
But bag matching does nothing to prevent a suicide terrorist from getting on a domestic flight with a bomb.
That whole theory breaks down in the context of a suicidal terrorist, where we have to count on the worst kind of enemy, one willing to sacrifice his or her own life in the course of killing others.
Airports nationwide and the TSA are working to fix this loophole with explosive detection. And without a continuing sense of urgency, experts wonder if the job will be done at all.
A year from now, we haven't had any incidents further against the aircraft, and people say, you know, this is an overreaction. We're spending too much on security. We need to back off. It's like playing Russian roulette, only we keep putting more bullets into the chamber and spending it.
Without more thorough safeguards, a bombing like the one over Lockerbie could easily happen again. On September 11th, 19 men prepare for battle. Their weapons are box cutters and sharp ceramic knives. They pack carefully. At various East Coast airports, the men walk through security screening. The X-rays outline a plastic shape and a small blade, perfectly legal. The metal detectors don't detect ceramic knives hidden on the body. None of the men are stopped, with devastating results.
The instruments that they used were purposely so to evade the requirements of the FAA and to evade what security personnel would have been looking for on that date.
Security checkpoints are the last line of defense in keeping terrorists off of planes. But they may also present the biggest risk. Before 9/11, the security screeners were governed by outdated regulations.
In 1985, when you put in place walk-through metal detectors and x-ray machines to screen carry-on luggage, that ended up causing a dramatic reduction in the number of aircraft hijackings.
This the bag?
The metal detectors and x-ray machines work well for catching metal knives and guns.
Is your bag? Yes, sir.
That's one problem. That's two problems.
In San Francisco, the screeners call Officer Gary DeQuisto when they find a suspect item.
Of course, your fellow passengers don't want to see you walk off the aircraft with this, now do they? And the nice policeman doesn't either. Where do you live, sir? In California, a weapon with two edges is considered a dagger. It's okay if you wear it where everybody can see it, but once you put it under your boot, once you put it under your coat, well, then it's a concealed weapon.
The gun is a paintball gun. It isn't deadly, but could still be used to make threats.
What you want to do is tell United Airlines that you have an air gun in there, because they discover it later when you hit the fan. Don't surprise United like you did me, okay? Tell them you've got no fuel for it, and then they'll probably let you just go. The FAA provides a stiff fine if you transport a weapon without notification. Okay? Okay. He's a nice kid, he just wasn't using his head there.
Highly publicized security breaches in the months after September 11th showed that too many weapons were getting through and more had to be done. At most airports, the airlines themselves were responsible for security screening.
The blame first and foremost lies with companies like American Airlines, United Airlines, Continental, Northwest, TWA, run down the list. They felt security measures that were being asked were too much, too costly.
The airlines saved money by hiring low-bidding private companies to staff the checkpoints. Security screeners made an average of $6 an hour, less than a manager at a fast food restaurant.
No one seemed willing before September 11th to pay security companies to do the job right in terms of maximum professionalism with adequate compensation, which then would allow them to lower turnover. Turnover was very high in the screening workforce in this country.
Turnover was often as high as 200% per year.
It's not easy. That job there is not easy. Too much pressure.
Screeners have a tough job, looking for that 1 in a million bag, or a person who isn't just a normal passenger. Since the attacks, the screeners are under huge pressure.
Since 9/11, security has been strict. Whatever policy they give us, we implement it.
Security at checkpoints now involves a number of steps designed to ensure that nothing dangerous slips through. After the ID and ticket check, every passenger walks through metal detectors. If the machines sound an alarm, screeners use wands to pinpoint the exact location of metal objects. Next is the pat-down, which should locate any hidden non-metal weapons. All carry-on bags are put through the X-ray machine, which automatically highlights shapes that may be suspect. The screeners now manually search all carry